Hey guys, tonight we're going back to the very beginning of human civilization, to those first flickering moments when our ancestors realized that surviving together meant more than just sharing fire and food. Picture yourself standing in a small clearing where nomadic families have gathered, the smoke from their evening fires curling up into a star-filled sky. You can hear the low murmur of voices as people debate something that seems almost absurdly simple to us now. Who gets to eat first? Who settles disputes? And what happens when someone takes more than their share? Chill. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for about why we follow rules that sometimes seem to make no sense at all. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Feel free to comment where and when you started watching this video, or maybe give a compliment about how these historical journeys help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported back roughly 12,000 years ago, to a time when the last ice age was finally loosening its grip on the world. Around you, small groups of humans are making one of the most momentous decisions in our species' history. They're choosing to stop wandering and start staying in one place. You watch as they clear patches of wild grain, learning through trial and error that scattered seeds can become next year's food supply. But as these early settlements grow from a few families to dozens, then hundreds of people, something unexpected happens. The informal agreements that worked when everyone knew everyone else's name start breaking down. You observe a heated argument brewing near the central fire pit. A strong young hunter has claimed the choicest cuts of meat from today's kill, leaving scraps for an elderly woman who contributed medicinal herbs to the community's welfare. In a nomadic group of 20 people, this dispute might have been settled by whoever had the loudest voice or the biggest stick. But here, with so many people watching, something different needs to happen. You notice how the crowd naturally turns to a grey-haired elder, someone who seems to carry the weight of unspoken authority. This is your first glimpse of customary law in action. You're witnessing the moment when human societies realize that survival depends not just on individual strength, but on predictable patterns of behavior that everyone can understand and follow. The elder doesn't consult any written rules because writing hasn't been invented yet. Instead, she draws on memory, precedent, and a shared sense of what feels right to the group. When I was young, she begins, her voice carrying across the settling darkness, my grandmother taught me that the hunter who risks his life for the group should eat well, but never so well that the providers of other gifts go hungry. You feel a chill of recognition as you realize you're watching the birth of legal precedent. This isn't law as we know it today, with courts and judges and written statutes. This is something much more fundamental, the collective human attempt to turn chaos into order through agreed-upon rules. The young hunter grumbles but hands over a portion of meat, and you see how the entire community relaxes slightly. A potential crisis has been averted not through violence, but through the application of custom that everyone recognizes as legitimate. As seasons pass in your time-traveling perspective, you watch these early communities develop increasingly sophisticated systems of unwritten law. You observe how certain individuals emerge as natural arbitrators, people whose judgment others trust even when the decisions go against their immediate interests. These early judges don't hold formal office. They simply possess the kind of wisdom and fairness that makes their neighbours seek them out when conflicts arise. You watch one such figure, a middle-aged woman with intricate tattoos marking her arms, as she mediates a complex dispute over water rights between two growing families. The case fascinates you with its modern parallels. One family arrived first at a choice spot near a spring, but the other family includes skilled toolmakers whose products benefit everyone. Who has the stronger claim to the best water access? You see the mediator walk both groups to the disputed spring, examine the land carefully, and then propose a solution that seems to satisfy no one completely, but everyone partially. The first family keeps their prime location, but agrees to share access during the dry season. The toolmakers receive preferential treatment for certain seasonal ceremonies. Both sides grumble, but both sides accept the arrangement. This, you realize, is where the concept of compromise first takes root in human legal thinking. Not the complete victory of one side over another, but the messy, practical art of finding solutions that communities can live with. You watch as word of this decision spreads to nearby settlements, becoming part of the growing body of precedents that people reference when facing similar disputes. Property disputes get resolved through ritual exchanges of gifts that seem elaborate to modernize but serve crucial social functions. Marriage arrangements are negotiated with ceremonies that make the unions visible to the entire community, establishing not just personal bonds but economic and political alliances. Even criminal behavior, when it occurs, is addressed through processes that emphasize restoration rather than punishment. A thief might be required to return twice what they stole, not to satisfy some abstract principle of justice, but to repair the social fabric that their actions had torn. You witness one such restoration ceremony during a cold autumn evening. A young man has been caught stealing grain from the communal storage pits, a serious offence that could threaten everyone's survival through the coming winter. In our modern legal system, he might face fines or imprisonment, but here you watch as the community gathers in a circle around the accused. The process isn't about determining guilt, which has already been established, but about finding a path back to social harmony. The thief's family speaks first, acknowledging the wrongdoing and offering compensation. The victims detail not just their material losses, but the fear and uncertainty the theft has caused. Community elders share stories of past similar cases and their outcomes. Finally, the young man himself must explain his actions and demonstrate his understanding of how they have affected others. The resolution involves returning the stolen grain, providing additional labour during the busy harvest season, and participating in a ritual meal that symbolically welcomes him back into the community's good graces. Historians still argue whether these early customary laws arose independently in different regions or spread through cultural contact. But you can observe how similar patterns emerge wherever humans gather in large enough numbers to need formal social organisation. The rules may vary dramatically from place to place, reflecting different environments and challenges, but the underlying human need for predictable, enforceable agreement seems universal. What strikes you most profoundly as you witness these ancient scenes is how organic the whole process feels. These aren't laws imposed from above by some distant authority. They're growing from the ground up, shaped by the practical necessity and refined through generations of trial and error. You watch children learning the customs by observing adults, absorbing the community's legal culture the same way they learn language or toolmaking. The law isn't something separate from daily life. It's woven into every interaction, every decision, every moment when people must choose between cooperation and conflict. As your vision of these early settlements begins to fade, you carry with you the profound realization that everything we call civilization rests on these humble beginnings. The courthouse in your hometown, the contracts you sign, even the simple act of waiting in line at the grocery store, all trace their ancestry back to those firelit circles where our ancestors first learned to transform individual desires into collective agreements. The first laws weren't written on stone tablets or parchment scrolls, they were written on the human heart, in the shared understanding that surviving together requires more than just good intentions. It requires the patient, difficult work of turning custom into something approaching justice. You find yourself stepping through the dusty streets of ancient Ur around 2100 BCE, where the air shimmers with heat and the scent of baked coal. The sun beats down mercilessly on your shoulders as you make your way toward a modest workshop where something extraordinary is happening. Inside, a scribe sits cross-legged on a woven mat, his reed stylus moving carefully across a wet clay tablet. But this isn't just another record of grain shipments or tax collections. You're witnessing the birth of written law itself, as humanity takes its first tentative steps toward transforming the fluid, memory-based customs you observed in earlier settlements into something permanent and unchanging. The scribe pauses, wiping sweat from his brow, and you peer over his shoulder at the wedge-shaped marks he's carefully impressing into the clay. These cuneiform symbols represent something revolutionary, the idea that legal principles can exist independently of the people who remember them. No longer will justice depend entirely on the failing memory of elderly arbitrators or the persuasive power of skilled speakers. For the first time in human history, the law is becoming something you can literally touch, something that will survive the death of its creators. You watch as the scribe struggles with a particularly complex legal concept, trying to capture in written symbols a nuanced understanding of property rights that has been passed down orally for generations. How do you write down the feeling of fairness that guides customary law? How do you translate the subtle negotiations and compromises you witnessed in those early settlements into stark, unambiguous text? The challenge is immense, and you can see the concentration etched on the scribe's weathered face as he searches for the right combination of symbols. The tablet he's working on deals with what we might recognize today as a contract dispute. A merchant has failed to deliver promised goods, and the injured party has brought the case before local authorities. But unlike the fluid, context-dependent resolutions you observed in prehistoric communities, this judgment is being recorded with precise details, the names of the parties, the exact nature of the goods, the compensation required, and most importantly, the legal reasoning behind the decision. Future judges will be able to consult this tablet when facing similar cases, creating the first primitive system of legal precedent based on written rather than remembered decisions. As you move through the streets of this ancient Mesopotamian city, you encounter other examples of law transitioning from custom to code. Near the temple complex, you find a collection of tablets that record what amounts to the world's first attempt at systematic legal education. Young scribes are copying and recopying important legal decisions, not just to preserve them, but to learn the reasoning patterns that underlie good judgment. You realize you're watching the emergence of legal scholarship, as human beings begin to treat law as a subject worthy of systematic study rather than simply inherited wisdom. The process fascinates you with its mixture of innovation and conservatism. The scribes aren't inventing entirely new laws. Instead, they're trying to capture and systematize the customary practices that have evolved over centuries. A quirky example catches your attention: detailed regulations about the proper way to sell beer, including specifications for the size of measuring cups and penalties for tavern keepers who water down their products. This isn't abstract jurisprudence, but practical law addressing the daily concerns of urban life. The fact that beer regulations needed to be written down tells you something important about how complex these early cities had become. You observe how the act of writing changes the very nature of law itself. Customary law was flexible, able to bend and adapt to particular circumstances, but written law introduces a new element: precision. The tablet you're examining specifies exactly how many barley measures constitute fair compensation for a damaged ox. There's no room for the nuanced negotiations that characterized earlier dispute resolution. The law is becoming more predictable, but also more rigid. Historians still argue whether this transition from custom to written code represents progress or loss, and you can see both sides of the debate playing out in the streets around you. A merchant celebrating a favourable judgment based on clear written precedent passes a frustrated plaintiff who might have received better treatment under the old system of personalised arbitration. The written law provides certainty and consistency, but it can't account for every unique circumstance that human conflicts present. The technical challenges of creating written law prove enormous. You watch scribes debating how to represent abstract legal concepts using a writing system originally designed for keeping track of sheep and grain. How do you write down the concept of intent? How do you distinguish between different types of harm? The solutions they develop seem crude by modern standards, but they represent humanity's first attempt to create a vocabulary for discussing justice in precise, replicable terms. As evening falls over the city, you find yourself in the home of an elderly judge who has witnessed this entire transition from memory-based to the text-based law. He shows you his personal collection of legal tablets, accumulated over decades of service. In the old days, he tells you, his voice heavy with nostalgia, we could feel our way to justice. Now we must think our way there. You sense both loss and gain in his words. The intuitive wisdom of customary law is giving way to something more systematic, but potentially less human. The judge explains how written law is changing the relationship between rulers and subjects. When law existed only in memory and custom, powerful individuals could more easily bend it to their will. But written law creates a kind of accountability. Even kings must justify their decisions against the recorded precedents. You're witnessing the earliest stirrings of what will eventually become constitutional government, though it will take millennia for the concept to fully develop. You notice how the physicality of these clay tablets affects their legal authority. Unlike modern law books that can be easily duplicated, each tablet represents significant labour and expense to create. The weight and permanence of baked clay gives these legal documents a gravity that purely oral traditions could never match. When a judge holds up a legal tablet during a dispute, everyone in the room understands they're confronting something more solid and enduring than human memory. The social implications ripple outward in ways that surprise you. Written law requires literacy, which remains rare and valuable. This creates a new class of legal professionals, scribes and judges who possess the specialized knowledge needed to interpret written legal codes. Justice is beginning its long evolution from a community process that everyone could participate in toward a specialized profession that requires years of training to master. As your time in ancient Mesopotamia draws to a close, you reflect on the profound transformation you've witnessed. The transition from custom to code represents more than just a technological advance. It marks humanity's first attempt to make justice systematic and scientific rather than intuitive and personal. The clay tablets scattered throughout this ancient city contain the DNA of every modern legal system, the first halting steps toward the complex world of statutes, precedents, and jurisprudence that governs our contemporary lives. You stand in the blazing heat of ancient Babylon, around 1750 BCE, your eyes drawn upward to a towering black stone monument that rises like a dark finger against the desert sky. The basalt pillar, nearly 8 feet tall, dominates the temple courtyard where crowds have gathered to witness something unprecedented in human history. Carved into its polished surface in elegant cuneiform script are 282 laws that will fundamentally change how civilizations think about justice. This is the Code of Hammurabi, and you're about to witness the world's first comprehensive attempt to create a complete legal system from scratch. King Hammurabi himself stands before the monument, a figure of imposing authority despite his relatively modest height. You can see the calculation in his weathered features as he gestures toward the carved stone. This isn't just lawmaking, it's political theatre on a grand scale. By codifying laws and displaying them publicly, Hammurabi is making a bold statement about the nature of royal power. No longer will justice depend on the whims of local officials or the varying customs of different regions within his empire. From this day forward, one law will govern all Babylonian subjects, from the banks of the Euphrates to the distant frontiers of his domain. You move closer to examine the intricate carvings, marvelling at the precision of the ancient stoneworkers at the top of the stele. You see a relief depicting Hammurabi receiving the laws directly from Shamash, the sun god of justice. The symbolism is unmistakable. These aren't merely human regulations, but divine commandments channeled through the king. This artistic choice reveals something crucial about how Soviet peoples understood the relationship between earthly and cosmic order. Law isn't just a practical tool for managing society, it's a reflection of the fundamental structure of the universe itself. As you read through the laws carved into the stone, you're struck by their remarkable specificity and their almost obsessive concern with proportionality. If a man damages the eye of another man, his eye shall be damaged. You read, recognizing the famous principle of lex talionis that will echo through legal systems for millennia. But the code goes far beyond simple eye for an eye justice. You find detailed regulations covering everything from medical malpractice to building codes, from marriage contracts to commercial disputes. One law catches your attention with its surprisingly modern sensibilities. If a surgeon operates on a man with a bronze knife and saves the man's life, he shall receive 10 shekels of silver. But the very next law reveals the harsh realities of ancient justice. If he causes the man's death, his hand shall be cut off. You're witnessing humanity's first attempt to balance incentives and punishments in professional regulation. Crude though it may seem to modern sensibilities, the social stratification embedded in Hammurabi's code fascinates and disturbs you in equal measure. You discover that identical crimes carry vastly different punishments depending on the social status of both perpetrator and victim. If a nobleman strikes another nobleman, he pays a fine. If he strikes a commoner, the penalty is lighter still. But if a slave dares to strike a free man, the punishment is brutal mutilation. You're seeing how law can simultaneously create order and institutionalize inequality, a tension that will plague legal systems throughout history. A particularly intriguing quirk emerges as you study the commercial regulations, detailed rules about tavern keepers, most of whom appear to be women, and their responsibilities to customers. If a female tavern keeper accepts grain instead of money for beer, she faces drowning as punishment. The specificity suggests that regulating the beer trade was a serious concern in ancient Babylon, though historians still argue whether these harsh punishments were regularly enforced or served primarily as deterrents. You observe how Hammurabi's code represents a revolutionary shift from the case-by-case justice you witnessed in earlier societies. Instead of responding to disputes as they arise, The king is attempting to anticipate every possible conflict and provide predetermined solutions. It's an ambitious project that reveals both the promise and the limitations of systematic legal thinking. The code's comprehensiveness is impressive, but its rigidity sometimes produces results that feel harsh or illogical. As you watch citizens examining the monument throughout the day, you notice how differently various groups respond to this legal innovation. Merchants seem pleased with the clear commercial regulations that will make trade more predictable across the empire. Nobles appear more cautious, perhaps recognizing that codified law limits their traditional privileges. Common people cluster around scribes who read the laws aloud, their faces showing mixtures of hope and apprehension as they contemplate this new system of predetermined justice. The psychological impact of written or public law proves as significant as its practical effects. For the first time in human history, ordinary people can know in advance what consequences their actions might bring. The uncertainty that characterized customary law, where outcomes depended heavily on local circumstances and the mood of judges, is being replaced by something approaching predictability. You can sense both the liberation and the anxiety this transformation creates in the crowd studying the monument. You're particularly struck by how Hammurabi's code attempts to address the problem of false accusations, a sophisticated concern that reveals the king's understanding of how legal systems can be abused. If a man charges another with murder but cannot prove it, the accuser shall be put to death. You read, "This principle of proportional punishment for false accusers shows an early recognition that legal systems must protect themselves against manipulation and misuse." The enforcement mechanisms embedded in the code reveal the practical challenges of implementing systematic law across a large, diverse empire. You notice references to local officials, judges, and governors who bear responsibility for applying these uniform laws to varied local circumstances. The tension between uniformity and flexibility that you're witnessing will become a central challenge for every subsequent legal system attempting to govern large, complex societies. As the sun sets over ancient Babylon, casting long shadows across the monument, you reflect on the magnitude of what you've witnessed. Hammurabi's code represents humanity's first serious attempt to create justice through systematic reasoning, rather than tradition or divine inspiration. The carved stone before you contains the seeds of every modern legal concept: due process, proportional punishment, commercial regulation, and the revolutionary idea that law should be public and knowable rather than secret and arbitrary. Yet you also recognize the code's limitations and the brutal realities of ancient justice. The death penalty appears with disturbing frequency, social inequality is legally enshrined, and the rigid application of predetermined punishments sometimes produces results that seem to violate our deeper sense of fairness. You're witnessing both the birth of systematic jurisprudence and a reminder that legal codes reflect the values and limitations of their creators. The crowds begin to disperse as darkness falls, but the monument remains, its black surface seeming to absorb the moonlight. You realize you're looking at more than just ancient law. You're seeing humanity's first attempt to capture justice in permanent form, to create order through reason rather than force, and to make the exercise of power accountable to something beyond the personal whims of rulers. The revolution that began with simple clay tablets in Mesopotamian workshops has culminated in this towering achievement, a legal system carved in stone that will influence lawmaking for the next 4,000 years. You find yourself gliding down the sacred Nile River on a ceremonial barge, the golden sun reflecting off the water's surface as it has for countless millennia. The year is approximately 1400 BCE. and you're traveling toward the great temple complex at Karnak, where something profoundly different from Hammurabi's harsh stone code is taking shape. The gentle lapping of water against the boat's hull creates a rhythmic soundtrack as you observe how ancient Egypt approaches the fundamental question of law and order through an entirely different lens. The concept of ma'at, divine truth and cosmic balance that governs not just human behavior, but the very structure of reality itself, the captain of your vessel, a weathered man whose hands show the calluses of decades working the river, points toward the approaching temple complex. The pharaoh consults with Ma'at herself, he tells you, his voice carrying the reverence that all Egyptians feel when discussing their unique approach to justice. You're about to witness how law can be understood not as a collection of specific rules, but as participation in the fundamental harmony that keeps the universe functioning properly. As you disembark and walk through the massive stone corridors of the temple, you encounter your first visual representation of Ma'at herself, an elegant woman wearing an ostrich feather in her hair, the symbol that will appear in countless Egyptian legal contexts. Unlike the harsh masculine authority of Mesopotamian law codes, Ma'at embodies a feminine principle of balance and truth that pervades Egyptian legal thinking. You're seeing how different cultures can construct entirely different relationships between divine will and human justice. In a judgment hall within the temple complex, you observe an Egyptian court in session, and the differences from Babylonian justice immediately strike you. Instead of consulting written laws to determine predetermined punishments, the judges are engaged in what appears to be a philosophical discussion about the cosmic implications of the case before them. A farmer accused of cheating his neighbour in a grain transaction isn't simply facing a fixed penalty. The court is exploring how his actions have disrupted the fundamental order that keeps Egyptian society functioning in harmony with the Nile's rhythms. The chief judge, his head shaved and gleaming in the torchlight, explains his reasoning to the assembled court. Ma'at requires that each person's actions strengthen the bonds that hold our community together. When this farmer took more than his fair share, he didn't just harm his neighbour, he weakened the cosmic order that ensures the Nile will continue to flood and our fields will remain fertile. You're witnessing a legal philosophy that sees individual acts as having universal consequences, a sophisticated understanding of how personal ethics connect to social harmony. What fascinates you most about Egyptian law is its emphasis on the intent behind actions rather than the actions themselves. Unlike Hammurabi's code, which focuses primarily on external behaviours and their consequences, Ma'at demands that judges examine the internal motivations that drive human conduct. You watch as witnesses are asked not just what the accused did, but why they believe he did it, what kind of person he has shown himself to be over time, and how his character aligns with or violates the principles of cosmic truth. The concept of the weighing of the heart, which you've encountered in Egyptian religious texts, proves central to their legal thinking as well. In the afterlife, the deceased person's heart will be weighed against Ma'at's feather of truth. If the heart is heavier than the feather, burdened with lies and selfishness, it will be devoured by the sun's monster Amit. You realise this isn't just religious mythology, but a sophisticated legal philosophy that makes moral weight literally measurable. Every lie told, every act of greed or cruelty, adds weight to the heart and disturbs the cosmic balance. A particularly intriguing case captures your attention as the afternoon proceedings continue. A wealthy merchant is accused of bribing a local official to gain favourable treatment in tax assessments. Under Hammurabi's code, this might result in a specific fine or punishment, but the Egyptian court approaches the matter entirely differently. The judges are concerned not just with the immediate harm caused by corruption, but with how such behaviour threatens the cosmic order that maintains Egyptian civilization's prosperity and stability. The merchant's defence reveals another distinctive aspect of Egyptian legal thinking: the emphasis on restoration rather than retribution. His advocate doesn't argue that he's innocent, but instead proposes a complex remedy designed to repair the damage his actions have caused to the community's moral fabric. He will return the improperly gained wealth, provide additional compensation to demonstrate his commitment to Ma'at, and participate in temple rituals designed to restore his spiritual balance. The goal isn't punishment, but reintegration into the cosmic order. You observe how Egyptian law handles what we might call victimless crimes, offences that don't directly harm other individuals but violate the principles of Ma'at. Lying, even when it doesn't immediately hurt anyone, is considered a serious offence because it disturbs the cosmic balance of truth. Greed, selfishness, and pride are legal concerns because they threaten the social harmony that keeps Egyptian civilization functioning. You're witnessing a legal system that treats ethics and law as inseparable aspects of the same cosmic order. The role of the pharaoh in this legal system proves both similar to and different from Hammurabi's position in Babylonian law. Like the Mesopotamian king, the pharaoh serves as the earthly representative of divine justice, but instead of receiving a complete code from the god, the pharaoh must continuously interpret Ma'at's requirements as they apply to changing circumstances. You watch as royal scribes record not rigid laws but flexible principles that local judges can adapt to specific situations while maintaining fidelity to the underlying cosmic order. Historians still argue whether Egyptian law was less developed than Mesopotamian law, or simply organised according to different principles, and observing both systems firsthand, you can appreciate the complexity of this debate. Egyptian law appears less systematic from our modern perspective, but it demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between individual behaviour and social stability that many contemporary legal systems struggle to address effectively. A quirky aspect of Egyptian justice emerges during the evening's final case, the trial of a cat accused of killing a sacred ibis bird. While this might seem absurd to modern sensibilities, you realise you're witnessing the logical extension of a legal philosophy that sees all actions as having cosmic significance. If Ma'at governs the entire universe, then even animal behaviour falls within its scope. The cat, obviously unable to defend itself, is represented by its owner, who must demonstrate that proper rituals of purification can restore the disturbed balance. As your day in the Egyptian court system draws to a close, you find yourself in conversation with an elderly judge who has served Ma'at for most of his adult life. He explains how Egyptian law differs from the written codes you've encountered elsewhere. "Those stone tablets tell you what to do," he says, gesturing dismissively. "Ma'at teaches you how to be." When you truly understand cosmic balance, right action flows naturally from right being. The philosophical sophistication of this approach impresses you, even as you recognize its practical limitations. A legal system based on cosmic harmony and divine truth requires judges of exceptional wisdom and moral authority. It works well when such individuals are available, but can become arbitrary and inconsistent when they're not. You're seeing both the highest aspirations of ancient jurisprudence and the challenges that arise when law becomes too closely identified with religious and philosophical speculation. As you prepare to leave ancient Egypt, drifting back down the Nile under a canopy of stars, you carry with you a profound appreciation for how differently human societies can approach the fundamental questions of justice and order. Where Mesopotamian law sought to create predictability through specific rules, Egyptian law pursued harmony through cosmic principles. Both approaches contain insights that remain relevant to contemporary legal thinking, reminders that law serves not just practical but spiritual needs, helping human communities maintain their connection to whatever they understand as ultimately true and sacred. You find yourself climbing the rugged slopes of Mount Sinai, the rocky terrain beneath your feet still warm from the desert sun, even though night has begun to fall. The year is approximately 1300 BCE, and below you stretches the camp of the Israelites, thousands of cooking fires flickering like earthbound stars across the wilderness. But your attention is drawn upward, toward the cloud-shrouded peak where something revolutionary is about to unfold. You're about to witness the moment when law becomes separated from royal decree and state power, transformed instead into a direct covenant between the divine and humanity itself. The mountain trembles beneath your feet as you ascend, and the very air seems charged with anticipation. Unlike the elaborate temple complexes where you observed Egyptian Ma'at or the royal palaces where Hammurabi proclaimed his code, this legal revelation is happening in the wilderness, far from the centers of civilization and political power. The setting itself carries profound implications. These laws won't emerge from human wisdom or royal authority, but from a direct encounter between Moses and the God who claims to have created the universe itself. As lightning splits the sky above you, illuminating the peak in stark, momentary brilliance, you witness Moses receiving not just another legal code, but something fundamentally different. Moral principles that claim universal validity regardless of culture, political system, or historical circumstances. The 10 Commandments that thunder from the mountaintop aren't addressed to Babylonians or Egyptians, or any particular nation, but to all human beings by virtue of their common humanity. You observe the profound simplicity of these initial laws compared to the elaborate legal codes you've encountered elsewhere. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. These aren't detailed regulations covering specific commercial disputes or property arrangements, but broad moral principles that establish the foundation for all subsequent legal thinking. You're witnessing law's transformation from a practical tool for managing society into a statement about the fundamental nature of right and wrong. The revolutionary character of this moment becomes clear as you consider what's missing from this divine legislation. There are no different punishments for different social classes, no special privileges for nobles or merchants, no recognition of the elaborate hierarchies that characterize every other legal system you've observed. Before God, apparently, all human beings possess equal moral status and bear identical responsibilities. You're seeing the birth of the concept that will eventually transform into ideas about human rights and equal justice under law. Descending the mountain with Moses, you watch as he struggles to communicate this revolutionary legal vision to a people shaped by centuries of Egyptian bondage. The tablets in his hands contain more than commandments. They represent a completely different way of understanding the relationship between divine authority and human governance. Unlike Hammurabi, who claimed to receive his laws from the gods but implemented them through royal power, Moses presents laws that bypass earthly rulers entirely, creating a direct relationship between the divine and individual moral conscience. In the camp below, you observe the Israelites' mixed response to this new form of law. Some seem relieved by the clarity and simplicity of the commandments. Others appear overwhelmed by the personal responsibility they impose. You're witnessing humanity's first encounter with law as moral obligation rather than simply social contract or royal decree. These people must obey not because a king commands it or because society benefits, but because the creator of the universe has declared certain behaviors fundamentally right or wrong. The democratic implications of Hebrew law gradually become apparent as you watch the community organize itself around these divine commandments. Since the laws come directly from God rather than through human intermediaries, no earthly ruler can legitimately claim absolute authority. Even kings, when they eventually emerge in Israelite society, remain subject to the same moral law that governs the humblest citizen. You're observing the earliest development of what will eventually become constitutional government and the rule of law. A particularly fascinating aspect of Hebrew jurisprudence reveals itself as Moses begins elaborating the basic commandments into more detailed legal provisions. Unlike other ancient legal codes that focus primarily on maintaining social order, Hebrew law demonstrates persistent concern for protecting society's most vulnerable members, widows, orphans, foreigners, and that their poor receive special attention in a way that seems almost anachronistic given the harsh realities of ancient society. You examine one especially intriguing provision, the requirement that all debts be forgiven every 7 years, and that Hebrew slaves be freed during the same sabbatical cycle. This isn't just economic policy, but a recognition that unchecked inequality can corrupt the moral foundations of society. Every generation receives a fresh start, preventing the accumulation of permanent disadvantage that characterizes most ancient civilizations. Historians still argue whether these provisions were regularly implemented, but their inclusion reveals a sophisticated understanding of how economic and moral concerns intersect. The concept of the Sabbath introduces another revolutionary element into legal thinking, the idea that law should protect human dignity against the demands of economic productivity. One day each week, all work ceases, not just for free citizens, but for slaves, servants, and even animals. You're witnessing the world's first labor protection law, a recognition that human beings possess inherent worth that transcends their economic utility. As you observe the development of Hebrew legal traditions over the following decades, you notice how the original moral principles generate increasingly sophisticated jurisprudential thinking. The command not to murder leads to detailed discussions about self-defense, capital punishment, and the distinction between intentional and accidental killing. The prohibition against theft evolves into complex property law that addresses everything from livestock disputes to inheritance rights. The role of judges in Hebrew law proves particularly significant as you watch the legal system develop. Unlike Egyptian judges who interpret cosmic balance or Babylonian officials who apply royal decrees, Hebrew judges serve as interpreters of divine law. Their authority comes not from the state, but from their understanding of God's requirements for human behavior. This creates a form of legal authority that can, at least in theory, challenge political power when rulers violate moral law. You witness this principle in action during a dramatic confrontation between the prophet Nathan and King David. When the king uses his royal power to arrange the murder of Uriah so he can marry Bathsheba, Nathan doesn't appeal to political considerations or reasons of state. Instead, he declares simply, "You are the man, condemned by God's law against murder and adultery." You're seeing how Hebrew legal thinking creates space for moral criticism of political authority, a concept that will prove crucial for later developments in constitutional government. The preservation of Hebrew law through written texts proves as significant as its content. Unlike the customary law that existed primarily in human memory, or the royal decrees that could be changed at will, these divine commandments are recorded in permanent form and treated as sacred text. This creates what may be humanity's first experience with constitutional law. binding legal principles that claim authority superior to any human government. A quirky but revealing aspect of Hebrew law emerges in its detailed regulations about ritual purity and dietary restrictions. These provisions might seem irrelevant to legal thinking, but they demonstrate how Hebrew jurisprudence refuses to separate law from morality or public behavior from private ethics. Every aspect of life falls under divine law, creating a comprehensive worldview in which legal, ethical, and religious obligations form an integrated whole. As your time with the ancient Israelites draws to a close, you reflect on the magnitude of the transformation you've witnessed. Hebrew law has introduced concepts that will reshape human civilization. The idea that moral principles transcend cultural boundaries, that all human beings possess equal dignity before ultimate authority, that law should protect the vulnerable rather than simply maintaining order, and that even rulers remain subject to moral standards they cannot change or ignore. The seeds planted on Mount Sinai will grow into ideas about natural law, human rights, constitutional government, and the moral foundations of political authority that continue to influence legal thinking today. You've witnessed law's transformation from a practical tool for social management into a statement about the fundamental nature of justice itself, a change that will echo through every subsequent attempt to create societies governed by principle rather than mere power. You find yourself standing in the bustling agora of Athens on a crisp morning in 508 BCE, surrounded by the animated voices of citizens engaged in heated debate. The marble columns of the nearby Stoa cast long shadows across the crowd as you witness something unprecedented in human history. Ordinary people arguing about the laws that will govern their own lives. This isn't a royal court where subjects petition for justice, nor a temple where priests interpret divine will. This is democracy in its raw, experimental form. And you're about to observe how the Greeks revolutionized legal thinking by making citizens themselves the ultimate source of legal authority. A herald's voice cuts through the morning chatter, calling the assembly to order. You follow the stream of male citizens as they make their way up the slopes of the Nix Hill, where a natural amphitheatre provides seating for thousands of participants in this grand democratic experiment. The contrast with everything you've witnessed in previous civilizations strikes you immediately. These aren't subjects receiving law from above, but citizens creating law through collective deliberation and debate. Cleisthenes, the man many call the father of democracy, rises to address the assembled crowd. His weathered face shows the strain of the radical constitutional reforms he's been implementing, but his voice carries conviction as he explains the revolutionary principle underlying their new system. The laws we make here today will bind us all equally, because we're all equally responsible for creating them. You're witnessing the birth of the idea that legitimate government requires the consent of the governed. The first case brought before the assembly involves a proposal to ostracize a prominent citizen whose growing influence threatens democratic institutions. Unlike the fixed punishments of Hammurabi's code or the cosmic justice of Egyptian Ma'at, this legal innovation allows the community to remove political threats without trials, accusations, or formal charges. You watch as citizens scratch names on pottery shards, participating in a process that seems almost casual, but addresses one of democracy's fundamental vulnerabilities: how to protect popular government from those who would destroy it. As the debate unfolds, you're struck by the sophisticated understanding of political psychology these ancient Greeks display. They recognize that democracy faces unique threats that monarchies and theocracies don't encounter. In other systems, political rivals can be controlled through force or religious authority, but in a democracy, ambitious individuals can use the system's own freedoms to accumulate power and eventually destroy popular government from within. Ostracism represents their innovative solution to this dilemma. The legal procedures surrounding ostracism fascinate you with their careful balance between popular will and individual protection. No one can be ostracized unless at least 6,000 citizens participate in the vote, ensuring that momentary passions or factional interests can't drive the process. The punishment isn't death or imprisonment, but temporary exile, and the ostracized person retains their property and citizenship rights. You're seeing democracy's first attempt to create legal mechanisms that protect the system while preserving individual dignity. Moving through different sections of the Agora, you encounter the various institutions that make Athenian democracy function. At the Heliaia, you observe the world's first jury system in operation. Unlike judges in other societies who derive authority from royal appointment or religious ordination, these jurors are ordinary citizens selected by lot. The randomness of the selection process reflects a profound democratic insight. In matters of justice, the collective wisdom of average people often proves superior to the sun-specialized knowledge of experts. You watch a commercial dispute being resolved by a jury of 201 citizens, chosen that morning through an elaborate system designed to prevent bribery and manipulation. The plaintiff, a merchant who claims his business partner has embezzled funds, presents his case directly to his fellow citizens without professional lawyers or complex legal procedures. The defendant responds with equal directness. Both sides understand that they're appealing not to legal technicalities but to their community's shared sense of fairness and justice. The jury's deliberation reveals the strengths and weaknesses of democratic legal thinking. These citizens bring practical wisdom and life experience to their judgment, understanding the commercial relationships involved in ways that professional judges might miss. But they also bring prejudices, personal interest, and varying levels of intelligence and attention. You're observing how democratic societies must trust imperfect processes to produce generally just outcomes, accepting occasional errors as the price of popular participation. Particularly innovative aspect of Athenian law emerges as you study their approach to legislation itself. Unlike other societies where laws are proclamations by rulers or interpretations of divine will, Athenian laws must survive public debate, formal voting, and subsequent review. Any citizen can challenge the constitutionality of proposed legislation through a process called graphe paranamon, essentially arguing that a new law violates fundamental democratic principles or contradicts existing legislation. You witness such a challenge during the afternoon session, as a young citizen named Demosthenes argues that a proposed tax law violates the principle of proportional contribution that underlies Athenian fiscal policy. His argument isn't based on technical legal reasoning but on democratic theory. Laws that burden citizens unequally without justification threaten the equality that makes democratic participation possible. The assembly listens carefully, recognizing that they're not just deciding a tax question, but defining the boundaries of legitimate democratic authority. The role of rhetoric in Athenian legal proceedings strikes you as both admirable and dangerous. Citizens must present their own cases, defending their interests through persuasive speech rather than legal technicalities. This democratizes legal participation, ensuring that justice doesn't become the monopoly of a professional class. But it also means that skilled speakers possess significant advantages over their less articulate neighbours, potentially undermining the equal treatment that democratic justice promises. You observe a master of rhetoric like Pericles addressing the assembly, his carefully crafted words swaying thousands of citizens with their emotional power and logical precision. The beauty of his speech impresses you, but you also recognize how such eloquence can manipulate as easily as it can illuminate. The Athenians themselves seem aware of this danger, having developed a healthy skepticism toward overly polished speakers and a preference for plain-spoken arguments that address practical concerns. Historians still argue whether Athenian democracy represents the pinnacle of ancient political achievement or a dangerous experiment in mob rule, and observing the system firsthand, you can appreciate both perspectives. The energy and intelligence of democratic DE produces innovative solutions to complex problems that autocratic systems might miss, but the same processes that encourage participation can also amplify popular prejudices and short-sighted thinking. A quirky but revealing institution captures your attention as the day progresses, the graphe Hebraeos, or prosecution for hubris. Unlike other legal systems that focus primarily on concrete harms, Athenian law recognizes offences against democratic dignity itself. Citizens who use their wealth or status to humiliate others, even without causing material damage, can face serious legal consequences. You're seeing how democratic societies must actively protect the equality of respect that makes popular government possible. As evening falls over Athens and the assembly begins to disperse, you find yourself in conversation with an elderly citizen who has participated in democratic institutions for decades. "We make many mistakes," he admits, gesturing toward the crowd streaming down from the pnyx. "But they are our mistakes, made by our own hands for our own purposes. That is what makes us free." His words capture something essential about the Greek contribution to legal thinking, the idea that imperfect self-government is preferable to perfect rule by others. The innovations you've witnessed in Athens will prove remarkably durable, surviving the city's political collapse and influencing legal development across centuries and continents. The concepts of jury trials, constitutional limitations on government power, public debate about legislation, and citizen participation in legal processes all trace their ancestry to these experiments in democratic governance. You've observed humanity's first systematic attempt to make law serve popular will rather than requiring popular submission to legal authority. As you prepare to leave ancient Athens, you carry with you both admiration for democratic achievement and awareness of democratic fragility. The Greeks have shown that ordinary people can govern themselves wisely when provided with appropriate institutions and procedures, but they have also revealed how easily those same institutions can be manipulated or corrupted by demagogues who understand how to exploit popular emotions for personal advantage. The balance between freedom and order, participation and expertise, majority rule and minority rights that you've witnessed here will challenge every subsequent democratic experiment. You march alongside Roman legions as they cross the fog-shrouded Rhine frontier. The rhythmic clank of armour and measured tread of hobnailed boots creating a steady percussion against the damp earth. The year is 50 CE, and you're witnessing something unprecedented in human history. A legal system that travels with its armies, adapts to local conditions, yet maintains consistent principles across an empire stretching from Britain's misty shores to Egypt's burning sands. This is Roman law in action, and you're about to observe how practical necessity and imperial ambition combine to create the legal framework that still governs much of the modern world. The commander of your legion, a weather-beaten veteran named Marcus Flavius, pauses to consult a leather scroll containing legal precedents for dealing with conquered territories. Unlike the Greeks with their philosophical debates or the Hebrews with their divine commandments, Romans approach law as engineering, a practical tool for building and maintaining the largest empire the world has ever seen. Law is what keeps the peace when the legions march elsewhere, he explains, his scarred hands tracing the carefully organized legal provisions that will soon govern the Celtic tribes beyond the river. As you establish camp in newly conquered territory, you observe Roman legal administrators immediately beginning their systematic work of jurisprudential colonization. They don't simply impose Roman law wholesale on subject peoples, nor do they completely abandon local customs. Instead, you witness something far more sophisticated: the gradual integration of useful local practices into an expanding framework of Roman legal principles. This flexibility, combined with underlying consistency, proves to be one of Rome's greatest innovations in legal thinking. A dispute between local Celtic chieftains provides your first glimpse of Roman legal pragmatism at work. Under traditional tribal law, their conflict over cattle theft would be resolved through single combat or blood feud, but the Roman magistrate assigned to hear the case approaches it entirely differently. He examines the evidence methodically, applies established principles of property law, and renders a decision based on written precedents rather than personal honour or tribal custom. The Celts seem initially bewildered by this approach, but gradually recognise its advantages: predictable outcomes, protection for the weak, and resolution without bloodshed. You're particularly struck by how Roman law handles the complex question of citizenship and legal status. Unlike other ancient societies with rigid caste systems, Rome offers a pathway for subject peoples to gradually acquire full legal rights through military service, commercial success, or administrative competence. You watch a Gallic merchant who has earned Roman citizenship use that status to invoke legal protections that would be impossible under tribal law. This isn't mere generosity, but calculated policy. By making Roman law attractive to local elites, the empire builds loyalty more effectively than force alone could achieve. The development of the 12 Tables centuries earlier had established the foundation for everything you're witnessing. You examine copies of these ancient laws, carved in bronze and displayed in public spaces throughout the empire. Unlike Hammurabi's royal decree or Moses' divine commandments, the 12 Tables emerged from political compromise between patricians and plebeians, establishing the crucial principle that law should be public, knowable, and equally applicable to all citizens regardless of social status. As you move through the empire's various provinces over the following months, you observe how Roman jurists adapt their legal principles to diverse local conditions while maintaining systematic consistency. In Egypt, they integrate aspects of pharaonic property law. In Greece, they incorporate democratic procedural innovations. In Germanic territories, they find ways to honour tribal customs within Roman legal frameworks. This isn't merely practical accommodation, but sophisticated jurisprudential thinking that recognises law's need to reflect local conditions while serving universal principles. The Roman conception of natural law proves particularly influential as you study their legal philosophy. Unlike purely positive law that derives authority from governmental decree, Roman jurists argue that certain principles reflect the fundamental nature of human society itself. You listen to heated debates in law schools where young Romans learn to distinguish between jus civile, law specific to Roman citizens, jus gentium, law common to all peoples, and jus naturale, law reflecting universal human nature. This theoretical framework will profoundly influence later European legal development. A fascinating case in the provincial courts demonstrates Roman law's sophistication in handling complex commercial relationships. A Syrian merchant has defaulted on loans from Jewish financiers to purchase goods from Egyptian suppliers, with the transaction occurring in Roman territory but governed by contracts written according to Greek legal traditions. Rather than simply applying Roman law mechanically, The magistrate carefully examines each legal tradition involved, extracts principles that protect legitimate expectations, and crafts a solution that seems fair to parties from 4 different legal cultures. You're amazed by the systematic organization that characterizes Roman legal thinking. Unlike the case-by-case approach of earlier societies, Romans have developed comprehensive categories for analyzing legal problems: persons, things, actions, and obligations. This taxonomic approach allows them to apply consistent reasoning to unprecedented situations, making law predictable even as circumstances change. You're witnessing the birth of legal science as a systematic discipline with its own methodological principles. The role of legal professionals in Roman society reveals another crucial innovation. Unlike other ancient systems where law remained primarily in the hands of priests, kings, or citizen amateurs, Romans have created a specialized class of jurists whose authority derives from their expertise rather than their political or religious position. You observe these legal scholars debating complex questions of inheritance, contract interpretation, and criminal procedure with the same systematic rigor that engineers bring to building aqueducts or roads. Historians still argue whether Roman law's greatest achievement lies in its practical effectiveness or its theoretical sophistication. But observing the system firsthand, that you appreciate how these 2 aspects reinforce each other. The empire's practical needs drive legal innovation, while systematic legal thinking makes imperial administration more effective and predictable. You're seeing how law and politics can create a mutually beneficial relationship rather than existing in tension. A particularly intriguing aspect of Wappi jurisprudence emerges in their treatment of slavery, an institution they never question but regulate with surprising care. Slave laws protect masters' property rights while recognizing slaves' essential humanity in ways that seem contradictory to modern sensibilities. You witness legal proceedings that treat slaves as both prisoners and a property depending on the context, revealing the internal tensions within Roman legal thinking about human dignity and social hierarchy. The Praetor's Edict, renewed annually, demonstrates Roman law's capacity for gradual evolution within stable institutional frameworks. You observe praetors introducing new legal remedies to address emerging social problems, always building on existing foundations rather than revolutionary change. This combination of continuity and adaptability proves crucial for a legal system that must govern diverse populations across centuries of social transformation. As your travels through the Roman Empire draw to a close, you find yourself in conversation with Gaius, one of the great legal scholars whose systematic textbook will influence legal education for over a millennium. We have built something that will outlast our armies and our emperors, he tells you, gesturing toward the impressive legal library surrounding you. Laws that can adapt to changing circumstances while preserving the wisdom of centuries. His prediction proves remarkably accurate. Long after Roman legions have withdrawn from distant frontiers and the empire itself has crumbled, Roman legal principles will continue to provide the foundation for legal systems across Europe and eventually around the world. The concepts of due process, property rights, contract law, and systematic jurisprudence that you've observed in action will prove more durable than marble monuments or military conquests. You leave ancient Rome with profound appreciation for how systematic thinking and practical experience can combine to create legal institutions of remarkable durability and adaptability. The Romans have shown that law can be both principled and pragmatic, both universal in its aspirations and flexible in its applications. Their greatest legacy isn't any particular rule or procedure, but the demonstration that human societies can create legal systems sophisticated enough to govern complex diverse civilizations while remaining faithful to fundamental principles of justice and order, you find yourself standing in a frost-covered clearing deep in the Germanic forests, surrounded by massive oak trees that seem to whisper ancient secrets in the winter wind. The year is 200 CE, and around you, warriors wrapped in thick furs and chainmail have gathered in a sacred grove for something that might seem primitive after witnessing Roman legal sophistication, but proves remarkably sophisticated in its own way. You're about to observe how Germanic tribes developed their own approach to law and justice, one that will eventually collide and blend with Roman tradition to create the hybrid legal systems that will govern medieval Europe. The tribal chieftain, his greying beard adorned with silver rings that catch the firelight, raises his spear to call the assembly to order. Unlike Roman courts with their professional judges and written precedents, this gathering operates according to principles that stretch back thousands of years into the Germanic past. Every free man in the tribe has the right to speak, and decisions emerge through a complex process of debate, consensus building, and ritual that treats law as a living expression of community values, rather than an abstract system of rules. A blood feud case dominates the evening's proceedings, and you witness firsthand how Germanic law approaches questions of crime and punishment entirely differently from the systematic Roman approach you've recently observed. A young warrior has killed another man's son in a drunken quarrel, and rather than seeking predetermined punishment from written codes, the assembly works to negotiate a resolution that will restore peace between the families involved. The concept of wergild, or blood money, proves central to their thinking. Every person has a specific monetary value based on their social status, and crimes can be resolved through carefully calculated compensation rather than retributive violence. The mathematical precision underlying Germanic legal thinking surprises you. What initially appears to be rough frontier justice reveals itself as a sophisticated system for quantifying relationships and obligations. A free farmer's life is worth 200 silver pieces, a nobleman's worth 600, a slave's worth 50. These aren't arbitrary numbers, but carefully calibrated values that reflect each person's contribution to tribal survival and their family's capacity to seek revenge if justice isn't satisfied. You're witnessing an early form of actuarial thinking applied to social harmony. As the dispute unfolds, you observe how Germanic law emphasizes collective responsibility in ways that Roman individualism would find difficult to understand. The killer's family must contribute to the wergild payment, while the victim's family must agree to accept compensation rather than pursuing vengeance. Extended kinship networks that might include dozens of people become involved in both the crime's consequences and its resolution. Law isn't something that happens to individuals, but something that engages entire communities in maintaining social balance. The role of oaths in Germanic legal procedure fascinates you with its blend of practical psychology and religious belief. When evidence is unclear or disputed, the accused can clear himself through oath swearing, but not alone. He must find oath helpers, respected members of the community who will swear to his character and truthfulness. The number of oath helpers required depends on the severity of the accusation and the social status of the parties involved. You're seeing how Germanic law uses social pressure and religious fear to extract truth in ways that don't require physical evidence or professional investigation. A particularly intriguing case involves a merchant accused of using false weights in grain transactions. Under Roman law, this might result in fines or imprisonment based on written commercial regulations. But the Germanic approach focuses on repairing damaged relationships rather than punishing abstract violations. The merchant must compensate those he cheated, pay additional amounts to demonstrate his commitment to honest dealing, and find oath helpers who will guarantee his future commercial behavior. The resolution aims to restore trust rather than simply deterring future violations. You observe how women participate in Germanic legal processes in ways that would be impossible under Roman law's strict patriarchal structure. While women cannot speak in the assembly, they play crucial roles in negotiating settlements, particularly in marriage disputes and property arrangements. Female heads of households can inherit and manage property, engage in commercial transactions, and even demand wagild for injuries to their honour. The legal status of Germanic women reflects their essential economic roles in societies where survival depends on everyone's contribution. The seasonal rhythm of Germanic legal proceedings reveals another distinctive aspect of their approach to justice. Major cases are heard during winter assemblies when agricultural work allows time for extended deliberation, but urgent matters requiring immediate attention are handled by smaller councils of elders throughout the year. This seasonal pattern reflects the deep integration between legal institutions and the practical realities of tribal life that Roman law's urban origins sometimes overlook. As you travel between different Germanic tribes over the following months, you're struck by the variations in their legal traditions despite underlying similarities. The Alemanni place greater emphasis on collective decision-making, while the Franks have developed more hierarchical procedures. The Goths have incorporated some Roman legal concepts through their contact with the empire, while more remote tribes maintain purely traditional approaches. You're witnessing legal evolution in real time as different societies adapt their ancestral customs to changing circumstances. The collision between Germanic and Roman legal traditions becomes visible as you observe frontier communities where both systems operate simultaneously. A dispute between a Roman citizen and a Germanic warrior raises fundamental questions about which legal tradition should apply. The Roman magistrate wants to follow written statutes and established procedures, while the Germanic chieftain insists on traditional negotiation and compensation. The eventual resolution requires compromise from both sides, creating a hybrid approach that foreshadows the legal synthesis that will characterize medieval Europe. Historians still argue whether Germanic legal traditions represented a regression from Roman sophistication or a different but equally valid approach to justice. And your first-hand observation suggests the question is more complex than either position acknowledges. Germanic law lacks Roman systematic organization and written precision, but it demonstrates sophisticated understanding of social psychology and community dynamics that Roman law sometimes neglects in its pursuit of abstract justice. A quirky but revealing aspect of Germanic legal culture emerges during a dispute over magical practices. A woman accused of causing crop failures through witchcraft faces what Romans would consider superstitious nonsense. But the Germanic approach treats the case with deadly seriousness. The legal question isn't whether magic actually works, but whether the community's belief in magical harm justifies compensation or punishment. You're seeing how law must address not just objective reality, but subjective community beliefs that shape social relationships. The trial by ordeal that resolves this witchcraft case demonstrates another distinctive feature of Germanic jurisprudence. When human judgment proves insufficient, the accused must undergo divine judgment through physical tests, walking on hot coals or retrieving objects from boiling water, or similar ordeals. While this might seem primitive compared to Roman evidence-gathering procedures, you recognize the psychological sophistication underlying the practice. The ordeal's psychological pressure often produces confessions or behavioral changes that achieve justice even when the physical test itself proves inconclusive. As you prepare to leave the Germanic forests, you find yourself in conversation with an elderly law speaker, one of the specialized individuals who memorize and recite legal traditions for the community. "Your Romans write everything down," he observes. But writing makes law cold and distant. When law lives in human memory and speech, it remains warm and alive, able to grow and change as the community needs. His words capture something essential about the Germanic contribution to legal development. The understanding that law must remain connected to lived experience rather than becoming purely academic exercise. The tribal legal traditions you've observed will prove remarkably durable, surviving military conquest and a religious conversion to influence European legal development for centuries. Concepts like collective responsibility, compensatory justice, and community participation in legal proceedings will blend with Roman systematic thinking to create the hybrid legal cultures of medieval Europe. You've witnessed not primitive law, but alternative approaches to justice that offer insights into possibilities that more systematic legal traditions sometimes overlook. The Germanic emphasis on restoration rather than retribution, community involvement rather than professional administration, and flexible adaptation rather than rigid consistency will contribute essential elements to legal synthesis that emerges as Roman and barbarian cultures gradually merge. You leave the forest clearing with profound appreciation for legal traditions that prioritize social harmony over abstract justice and community wisdom over professional expertise. Recognizing that different approaches to law serve different human needs and social circumstances. You find yourself beneath the blazing sun of 7th century Arabia, standing in the courtyard of a modest mosque in Medina where something unprecedented in legal history is taking shape. The year is 602 CE, and around you, companions of the Prophet Muhammad are engaged in intense debate about how to preserve and systematize the divine revelations and prophetic traditions that will become Islamic law. Unlike the human reasoning of Roman jurists or the ancestral customs of Germanic tribes, you're about to witness the development of a legal system that claims direct divine origin while demonstrating remarkable sophistication in its methods of interpretation and application. The heat shimmers off the sand-coloured walls as Abu Bakr, the first caliph, addresses a gathering of scholars and judges. His weathered face shows the strain of governing a rapidly expanding Islamic community that now stretches from the Arabian Peninsula into the lands of the former Persian and Byzantine empires. "The Prophet, peace be upon him, has left us the Quran and his Sunnah," he explains, his voice carrying the weight of immense responsibility. But how do we apply these divine teachings to questions he never explicitly addressed? You're witnessing the birth of Islamic jurisprudence, the systematic attempt to derive comprehensive legal guidance from limited but sacred sources. The methodology that emerges from these early discussions fascinates you with its blend of reverence for divine authority and sophisticated legal reasoning. The Quran provides explicit guidance on some matters, from inheritance laws to criminal punishments, but remains silent on countless practical questions that arise as Islamic civilization encounters new cultures and circumstances. The scholars around you are developing the principles of ijtihad, independent reasoning based on Islamic sources, that will allow the law to grow and adapt while maintaining fidelity to divine command. You observe a complex case being debated that demonstrates Islamic law's unique approach to legal reasoning. A Muslim merchant trading in Byzantine territory has entered into a contract using local commercial practices not mentioned in Islamic sources. Is such a contract valid under Islamic law? The scholars examine the Quran for relevant principles, study the Prophet's recorded practices and sayings, and apply analogical reasoning to derive a solution that honors both Islamic values and practical necessity. Their method combines religious devotion with logical rigor in ways that create a distinctive form of legal thinking. The concept of consensus, or ijma, provides another crucial tool for Islamic legal development. When the scholarly community agrees unanimously on a legal question, their consensus becomes binding for future generations. You watch as scholars from different regions debate a question about ritual purity, gradually working toward agreement through careful examination of sources and reasoned argument. The process reveals how Islamic law balances individual scholarly expertise with collective wisdom, preventing any single interpreter from claiming definitive authority, while ensuring that legal development remains grounded in community judgment. As you travel through the expanding Islamic world over the following decades, you witness how Islamic law adapts to diverse cultural contexts while maintaining its essential character. In Damascus, former Byzantine legal practices are evaluated for compatibility with Islamic principles. In Baghdad, Persian administrative traditions are integrated into Islamic governance. In Cairo, local commercial customs are examined for conformity with Quranic teachings about trade and finance. You're seeing how the legal system rooted in Arabian desert culture develops the flexibility to govern sophisticated urban civilizations across 3 continents. The development of different schools of Islamic jurisprudence reflects both the system's intellectual vitality and its practical challenges. You observe heated debates between followers of different methodological approaches, some emphasizing strict adherence to textual sources, others allowing greater scope for reasoned interpretation, still others prioritizing the practical needs of Muslim communities. These aren't merely academic disputes, but fundamental disagreements about how divine law should function in human society. A particularly fascinating aspect of Islamic legal thinking emerges in its treatment of non-Muslim populations within Islamic territories. Unlike legal systems that assume cultural homogeneity, Islamic law must address the reality of governing diverse religious communities. The concept of dhimmi status provides a framework for protecting religious minorities while maintaining Islamic political authority. You observe Christian and Jewish communities maintaining their own legal systems for personal and religious matters, while participating in broader Islamic commercial and criminal law for matters affecting the wider society. The role of the Qadi, or Islamic judge, proves crucial to the system's practical operation. Unlike Roman magistrates who apply predetermined rules or Germanic elders who facilitate community negotiation, Islamic judges must balance textual interpretation, reasoned analysis, and practical wisdom in reaching decisions. You watch an experienced Qadi in Cordoba handling a complex inheritance dispute that involves Quranic principles, prophetic traditions, scholarly consensus, and local circumstances. His methodology demonstrates how Islamic law combines systematic reasoning with case-by-case flexibility. Islamic commercial law develops sophisticated approaches to economic relationships that reflect both religious values and practical necessity. The Quranic prohibition on riba, or usury, requires creative solutions to the credit needs of expanding trade networks. You observe Muslim merchants developing complex partnership arrangements, profit-sharing agreements, and risk distribution mechanisms that achieve the economic functions of interest-bearing loans while conforming to Islamic ethical principles. These innovations will eventually influence European commercial law through contact in Spain and the Crusades. Historians still argue whether Islamic law's divine foundation enhanced or limited its capacity for development and adaptation. But your first-hand observation suggests the relationship is more complex than either position acknowledges. The system's religious authority provides stability and legitimacy that purely human legal systems often lack, but the requirement for divine justification can make necessary changes difficult to implement when they appear to conflict with established interpretations. A quirky but revealing case emerges during your time in Baghdad. Where Islamic scholars debate whether newly discovered philosophical works from ancient Greece can be legally studied by Muslims, the question involves not just intellectual curiosity, but fundamental issues about the relationship between revealed knowledge and human reasoning. The eventual resolution, which permits study of Greek philosophy as a tool for better understanding Islamic truth, demonstrates how Islamic legal thinking can accommodate intellectual innovation while maintaining religious integrity. The institution of the Hizbah, or market inspection, reveals how Islamic law integrates moral and commercial concerns in ways that other legal systems often separate. You observe a muhtasib in Cairo examining not just weights and measures, but the ethical behavior of merchants, ensuring that commercial transactions conform to Islamic principles of honesty and fair dealing. This integration of legal and moral oversight creates a comprehensive approach to social regulation that treats economic activity as inseparable from religious obligation. The development of Islamic family law demonstrates both the system's sophistication and its challenges in balancing divine command with social needs. Quranic provisions about marriage, divorce, and inheritance provide detailed guidance that must be applied to varying cultural contexts across the Islamic world. You witness scholarly debates about polygamy, women's property rights, and child custody that reveal tensions between literal textual interpretation and practical social considerations. As your journey through the early Islamic legal world draws to a close, you find yourself in conversation with al-Shafi'i, the great legal scholar whose systematic methodology will profoundly influence Islamic jurisprudence. God has provided guidance for every human situation, he explains, but sometimes that guidance must be discovered through careful reasoning rather than simple reading. The law grows through human effort guided by divine wisdom. His words capture the essential genius of Islamic legal thinking, the combination of absolute religious authority with sophisticated interpretive methodology. The legal system you've observed will prove remarkably durable and influential, providing the foundation for governance across much of Africa, Asia, and parts of Europe for over a millennium. Its methods of textual interpretation, analogical reasoning, and scholarly consensus will influence not only Islamic societies but Christian and Jewish legal thinking through intellectual contact and cultural exchange. The synthesis of divine authority and human reasoning that characterizes Islamic law offers insights into possibilities for integrating religious values and practical governance that remain relevant to contemporary legal thinking. You leave the Islamic world with profound appreciation for a legal tradition that demonstrates how systematic reasoning and religious devotion can reinforce rather than contradict each other. Islamic law's combination of textual foundation, interpretive flexibility, and scholarly rigor creates a distinctive approach to justice that has proven capable of governing diverse societies across centuries of social change while maintaining essential continuity with its divine origins. You find yourself walking through the muddy streets of a medieval European town in the year 1150 CE, where the morning mist carries the sound of church bells calling the faithful to prayer, while merchants haggle over prices in the marketplace below. The cobblestones beneath your feet are worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic, but the legal landscape around you is anything but settled. You're entering a world where multiple systems of law compete for authority over the same people and territory, creating a complex web of overlapping jurisdictions that somehow manages to function despite its apparent chaos. The cathedral's massive stone towers dominate the skyline, their Gothic arches reaching toward heaven in a display of ecclesiastical power that extends far beyond the spiritual realm. Canon law, the legal system of the Catholic Church, claims authority over all matters touching the soul: marriage, divorce, inheritance, contracts involving oaths, and virtually any dispute where one party takes sanctuary in holy ground. You observe a church court in session, where robed clerics debate whether a merchant's broken promise constitutes a sin, requiring spiritual penance as well as material compensation. But as you move towards the castle that overlooks the town, you encounter an entirely different legal authority. Feudal law governs the relationships between lords and vassals, the obligations of military service, and the complex web of land tenure that forms the backbone of medieval society. You witness a ceremony where a young knight kneels before his lord, placing his hands between the lord's hands and swearing an oath of loyalty that creates legal obligations binding on both parties. This isn't written law but ritual law, creating rights and duties through symbolic acts that carry the weight of sacred tradition. The town's charter, displayed prominently in the guild hall, represents yet another layer of legal authority. Municipal law grants the townspeople specific rights and privileges: the freedom to trade without feudal interference, the right to elect their own magistrates, and exemption from certain aristocratic obligations. You watch the town council, composed of successful merchants and craftsmen, debate local regulations about market practices, building standards, and public order. Their authority derives neither from divine appointment nor feudal hierarchy, but from royal grants and collective agreement among the townspeople themselves. A dispute over a marriage contract reveals how these competing legal systems interact in practice. The couple was married according to local custom, but the bride's father now claims the marriage is invalid because it wasn't blessed by a priest. The groom's family argues that their handfast ceremony followed ancient tradition and created binding obligations. Meanwhile, the feudal lord claims jurisdiction because both families hold land from him. You're witnessing medieval Europe's unique contribution to legal thinking, the management of overlapping authorities that must somehow coexist within the same society. The resolution of this marriage dispute demonstrates the sophisticated negotiations required to make medieval law function. The church court agrees to validate the marriage retroactively in exchange for a substantial donation to the cathedral building fund. The feudal lord waives his jurisdictional claims in return for the family's agreement to provide additional military service during the next harvest season. The town council records the settlement to establish precedent for future similar cases. No single authority dominates, but all parties find ways to protect their essential interests. You observe how different social classes navigate this complex legal landscape with varying degrees of success. Nobles can appeal to feudal law when it serves their interests, invoke ecclesiastical protection when facing criminal charges, or claim royal jurisdiction when local authorities prove unfavourable. Merchants use their wealth and political influence to shape municipal law in their favour, while maintaining good relationships with both church and feudal authorities. Peasants, lacking such options, often find themselves subject to whichever legal system offers them the least protection and the harshest treatment. The rise of universities creates yet another centre of legal authority as scholars begin to systematically study and teach both Roman law and canon law. You attend lectures at the University of Bologna, where students from across Europe learn to apply the systematic reasoning of Roman jurisprudence to contemporary legal problems. These academic lawyers, trained in textual analysis and logical argument, gradually begin to influence all the medieval legal systems, introducing scholarly methods that emphasize consistency and rational analysis over custom and precedent. Historians still argue whether medieval legal pluralism represented sophisticated institutional innovation or simply administrative chaos. But observing the system firsthand, you appreciate both its flexibility and its complexity. The multiple sources of legal authority create opportunities for forum shopping and strategic maneuvering that can benefit those skilled enough to navigate the system. But the same complexity can trap the unwary in contradictory obligations and competing jurisdictions. A particularly revealing case involves a monastery's dispute with local nobles over water rights. The monks claim ecclesiastical immunity from secular interference, invoking canon law and papal authority to support their position. The nobles argue that water rights are temporal matters governed by feudal law and custom. The case bounces between different courts for months, with each authority claiming jurisdiction, while none wanting to risk a definitive ruling that might challenge the other's legitimacy. The eventual settlement, negotiated privately between the parties, avoids any clear precedent that might clarify jurisdictional boundaries. The development of merchant law, or lex mercatoria, demonstrates how medieval society creates new legal authorities to address emerging needs. International trade requires legal standards that transcend local jurisdictions, but no single authority possesses the power to impose uniform commercial regulations across Europe. Instead, merchant communities develop their own courts, procedures, and substantive rules based on commercial custom and practical necessity. You observe a merchant tribunal resolving a complex dispute about cargo damaged during the transport from Venice to London, applying legal principles that exist nowhere in formal written codes but command respect across national boundaries. The crusading movement adds another layer of complexity to medieval legal thinking, as Christian warriors encounter Islamic law in the Holy Land. Some Crusader kingdoms adopt modified versions of Islamic commercial and administrative law while maintaining Christian personal and religious law. You witness negotiations between Christian and Muslim merchants who must find common legal ground for conducting business despite their different legal traditions and religious obligations. Royal law emerges gradually as medieval kings assert greater central authority, often in tension with existing feudal, ecclesiastical and municipal jurisdictions. King Henry II of England's judicial reforms, which you observe during a visit to Westminster, demonstrate how royal authority can gradually absorb other legal systems without completely destroying them. Royal courts offer more predictable procedures and broader territorial authority than local alternatives, gradually attracting cases that might previously have been resolved through other channels. A quirky but significant development occurs as medieval lawyers begin to grapple with the legal status of corporations, particularly monasteries and guilds that claim to exist independently of their individual members. How can a legal entity that has no physical body be held responsible for contracts and crimes? The solutions medieval lawyers develop, treating corporations as artificial persons with legal rights and duties, will profoundly influence later commercial and constitutional law. The Inquisition represents perhaps the most systematic attempt to resolve conflicts between secular and ecclesiastical authority. You observe inquisitorial proceedings where trained canon lawyers apply sophisticated investigative techniques to questions of heresy and religious orthodoxy. While the Inquisition's methods often seem harsh by modern standards, its procedures demonstrate remarkable attention to evidence gathering, witness examination, and appeals processes that influence the development of criminal law throughout Europe. As your time in medieval Europe draws to a close, you find yourself in conversation with a scholar at the University of Paris who's attempting to synthesize the various legal traditions into a coherent theoretical framework. Each system of law serves essential needs, he explains, but none alone can govern the complexity of human society. Perhaps wisdom lies not in choosing between them, but in learning how they can work together. His words capture the essential achievement of a medieval legal thinking, the demonstration that Legal pluralism, despite its complications, can provide more comprehensive justice than any single system of authority. The synthesis you've observed will prove foundational for later European legal development. The tension between competing authorities creates pressure for clearer jurisdictional boundaries, more systematic procedures, and better theoretical justification for legal authority. The medieval experience with legal pluralism provides essential background for understanding both the later centralization of royal authority and the constitutional limitations placed on governmental power. You've witnessed humanity's most complex experiment in managing multiple sources of legal authority within a single society, an achievement that continues to influence contemporary thinking about federalism, international law, and the relationship between religious and secular authority. You find yourself standing in a muddy field called Runnymede on a grey June morning in 1215, watching one of the most consequential moments in the history of law unfold before your eyes. The Thames flows sluggishly nearby, its waters reflecting the overcast sky, as King John of England, his face a mask of barely controlled fury, reluctantly approaches a group of armed barons who have forced this confrontation. Around you, the tension is palpable as nobles, church officials, and royal administrators gather to witness something unprecedented. A king being compelled to submit to written limitations on his own power. The parchment document that will soon be sealed contains provisions that seem almost mundane compared to the revolutionary principle they represent. You read over the shoulder of a clerk as he makes final corrections to the text. Regulations about fish weirs in rivers, standardized weights and measures for grain, restrictions on taking horses and carts for royal service without payment, but buried within these practical concerns are clauses that will transform the legal thinking across centuries. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. Archbishop Stephen Langton, his ecclesiastical robes mud-stained from the morning's negotiations, explains the document's significance to a group of younger clerics. Today we establish that even kings must answer to law, he declares, his voice carrying both satisfaction and apprehension. Never again can royal will alone determine what justice means. You're witnessing the birth of constitutional government, the radical idea that political authority must operate within legal boundaries that it cannot arbitrarily change. The barons who have forced this confrontation aren't motivated by abstract theories of limited government, but by practical grievances against John's arbitrary rule. You listen as they recite their complaints: excessive taxes imposed without consultation, property seized without legal process, punishments inflicted without trial. Their solution isn't to replace the king, but to bind him with legal obligations, creating a framework where royal power serves law rather than law serving royal power. As the morning progresses, you observe the delicate negotiations over language that will define constitutional thinking for centuries. When the document speaks of free men, does it include only nobles or all subjects? The phrase lawful judgment of his equals seems to require trial by jury. But what exactly constitutes adequate judicial process? These questions, debated hastily in a muddy field, will occupy legal scholars and political theorists for generations. The sealing ceremony itself reveals the symbolic importance of written constitutional limitations. King John's Great Seal, pressed into warm wax, transforms political promises into legal obligations that claim binding force on future rulers. You're witnessing law's transformation from royal command to constitutional contract, a change that makes government accountable to principles beyond its own will. The parchment before you contains the DNA of every subsequent attempt to limit governmental power through written constitutional provisions. But Magna Carta's immediate aftermath demonstrates the practical difficulties of enforcing constitutional limitations on reluctant rulers within months of the sealing. John repudiates the agreement and civil war erupts across England. You watch as barons and royal forces clash over whether written law can effectively constrain political power when that power controls military force. The document's survival requires not just legal authority, but political enforcement mechanisms that can compel compliance from those who would prefer to ignore constitutional restrictions. The gradual implementation of Magna Carta's principles over the following decades reveals how constitutional law develops through practice rather than theory. You observe English courts slowly expanding the meaning of due process of law to cover situations the original drafters never contemplated. Royal officials find themselves constrained by legal procedures that make arbitrary action more difficult and expensive. The Charter's provisions become embedded in judicial decisions, administrative practices, and political expectations in ways that make constitutional limitations increasingly difficult to ignore or reverse. The development of common law proves crucial to Magna Carta's long-term influence. Unlike continental European legal systems based on Roman law codes, English law develops through judicial decisions that create binding precedents for future cases. You watch royal judges applying charter principles to specific disputes, gradually building a body of case law that makes constitutional limitations concrete and enforceable. The interaction between written constitutional text and judicial interpretation creates a dynamic system where legal principles can evolve while maintaining continuity with foundational commitments. A particularly significant case emerges during the reign of Henry III, when royal officials attempt to seize property without following proper legal procedures. The property owner appeals to Magna Carta's guarantee of due process, and the royal courts must decide whether the Charter's provisions actually bind the king's agents in practical situations. Their decision to uphold the Charter's restrictions on royal power establishes the crucial precedent that constitutional law creates enforceable rights rather than mere political aspirations. You observe how Magna Carta's influence spreads beyond England through the networks of trade, scholarship, and political communication that connect medieval Europe. Legal scholars at continental universities study the document as an example of how written law can limit royal authority. Merchants trading with English ports encounter legal procedures that protect their property rights in ways that purely royal systems cannot guarantee. The Charter becomes a model for other attempts to constrain governmental power through constitutional means. The parliamentary system that gradually develops in England draws heavily on Magna Carta's principles while extending them in new directions. You witness early parliamentary sessions where representatives demand that the king obtain consent before imposing new taxes, invoking the Charter's requirement for lawful procedure in matters affecting property rights. The principle that governmental power requires legal justification evolves into the more specific requirement that certain governmental actions require legislative approval. Historians still argue whether Magna Carta represents a progressive step toward democratic government or a conservative attempt to preserve feudal privileges, but observing its development firsthand suggests the distinction may be less important than the procedural innovations it introduces. The Charter's requirement that governmental action follow established legal procedures creates space for political opposition and judicial review that serves constitutional purposes regardless of its drafters' intentions. A quirky but revealing provision in the Charter addresses the treatment of foreign merchants, guaranteeing them safe conduct and fair treatment in English courts. This seemingly minor clause reflects the Charter's broader significance as an attempt to make law predictable and reliable, rather than dependent on royal favour or personal relationships. International commerce requires legal systems that function according to known rules rather than arbitrary decisions, and the Charter's commercial provisions help establish England as a reliable trading partner. The Charter of the Forest, sealed simultaneously with Magna Carta, demonstrates how constitutional thinking extends to environmental and economic regulation. By limiting the king's authority to create royal forests and restricting penalties for forest offences, this companion document establishes legal principles about sustainable resource management and proportional punishment that anticipate later environmental law. You're seeing how constitutional limitations can protect not just individual rights, but community resources essential for long-term social welfare. As your time in medieval England draws to a close, you find yourself in Westminster Hall listening to Chief Justice Henry de Bracton explain how Magna Carta has transformed English legal thinking. The king is under no man, he declares, but he's under God and the law, for law makes the king. His words capture the revolutionary principle that political authority derives its legitimacy from conformity to legal standards that exist independently of governmental will. The document sealed at Runnymede will prove remarkably durable and influential, surviving attempts at royal repudiation, civil wars, and centuries of social change to become a foundational text for constitutional government worldwide. Its principles will inspire American colonists resisting parliamentary taxation, French revolutionaries overthrowing royal absolutism, and countless subsequent movements seeking to limit governmental power through legal means. You've witnessed the moment when law began its long evolution from royal command to constitutional constraint, establishing the principle that legitimate government requires legal justification for its actions. The common law system that develops from Magna Carta's foundation will spread throughout the English-speaking world, creating legal traditions that emphasize judicial independence, due process rights, and constitutional limitations on governmental power. You leave medieval England with profound appreciation for how a practical political compromise in a muddy field can establish legal principles that reshape human civilization, demonstrating that constitutional government emerges not from abstract theory, but from the practical necessity of making political power accountable to law. You find yourself in the grandiose Palace of Versailles in 1804, walking through marble corridors lined with mirrors that reflect both the opulent splendour of French imperial power and the revolutionary transformation of European law taking place within these walls. Napoleon Bonaparte, recently crowned Emperor of the French, strides past you toward a conference room where some of Europe's most brilliant legal minds are assembled around polished mahogany tables covered with manuscripts, drafts, and legal treatises. You're about to witness the creation of the Code Civil, a systematic legal framework that will become the template for modern law across much of the world. The atmosphere in the working chambers buzzes with intellectual energy as legal scholars debate fundamental questions that have puzzled jurists for centuries. Jean-Jacques Régis de Cambacérès, the second consul and driving force behind the codification project, spreads out competing draft proposals while Napoleon himself interjects with characteristically blunt questions about practical implementation. Will a farmer in Normandy understand this provision about property or inheritance? The Emperor demands, his finger jabbing at a particularly complex paragraph. Law must serve the people, not confuse them. You observe how these French jurists are attempting something far more ambitious than previous legal codifications. Unlike Hammurabi's collection of specific rules, or even Justinian's compilation of Roman precedents, the Code Civil aims to create a complete, systematic, and logically coherent legal system that can govern all aspects of civil life. The challenge is immense. How do you reduce the infinite complexity of human relationships to clear, predictable rules while maintaining enough flexibility to address unforeseen circumstances? The revolutionary context that shaped this legal undertaking becomes apparent as you listen to debates about fundamental principles. The old feudal system, with its complex web of overlapping authorities and inherited privileges, has been swept away by the revolution, creating both opportunity and necessity for systematic legal reconstruction. These lawyers aren't just organising existing law, but creating new legal foundations for a society transformed by the revolutionary ideals of equality, rationality, and individual rights. A heated discussion about marriage law reveals both the code's progressive and conservative elements. The assembled jurists agree that marriage should be a civil contract rather than purely religious sacrament, but they debate whether women should possess equal property rights within marriage. You watch as Enlightenment principles of individual liberty clash with traditional assumptions about family hierarchy and social order. The eventual compromise recognizes marriage as a civil institution, while preserving male authority over family property and decision-making. The systematic organization that characterizes the Code Civil fascinates you with its logical precision and comprehensive scope. The drafters have organized all civil law into three major categories: persons, property, and the acquisition of property rights. Within each category, they've created subcategories and detailed provisions that attempt to address every conceivable legal situation. You're witnessing the birth of modern legal taxonomy, the systematic classification of legal relationships that makes complex law accessible to both lawyers and ordinary citizens. Napoleon's personal involvement in the drafting process proves more substantial than you might expect from a military leader focused on conquest and administration. You observe participating in detailed discussions about contract law, property rights, and family relationships, often bringing practical insights from his experience governing diverse populations across Europe. His famous comment that "my true glory is not to have won 40 battles, it is my civil code that will live forever," reflects his understanding of law's lasting importance for social organization. The relationship between the Code Civil and Roman law demonstrates both continuity and innovation in legal development. The French jurists draw heavily on Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis and centuries of scholarly commentary, but they adapt Roman principles to modern circumstances and revolutionary ideals. You watch as they extract the systematic reasoning methods of Roman jurisprudence while rejecting its aristocratic assumptions and class-based distinctions. The result is recognizably Roman in its logical structure, but thoroughly modern in its egalitarian principles. A particularly revealing debate emerges over the treatment of property rights, where Enlightenment individualism encounters practical necessities of social organization. The Code enshrines private property as a fundamental right, but it must also address questions about community resources, public necessity, and environmental stewardship that pure individualism cannot easily resolve. You observe sophisticated discussions about the balance between individual freedom and social obligation that anticipate later debates about regulatory authority and environmental law. The international influence of the Code Civil becomes apparent even before its completion as legal scholars from across Europe travel to Paris to observe the drafting process. Representatives from German states, Italian principalities, and Spanish colonies seek to understand how systematic codification might serve their own legal reform efforts. You're witnessing the beginning of a global process of legal modernization that will see versions of the French Civil Code adopted across 6 continents. As you travel through Europe over the following decades, you observe how the Code's influence spreads through both conquest and voluntary adoption. Napoleon's armies carry French legal principles into occupied territories, But even after military withdrawal, many regions retain modified versions of the code because of its practical advantages over traditional legal systems. The systematic organization and clear language that make the code accessible to educated citizens prove attractive to societies seeking to modernize their legal institutions. Historians still argue whether the Code Civil represents the culmination of Enlightenment legal thinking or the beginning of modern technocratic administration. But observing its creation and early implementation suggests both characterizations contain truth. The Code embodies Enlightenment ideals of rational organization and individual rights, but it also demonstrates how systematic law can become a tool for governmental control and social engineering that exceeds anything previous societies achieved. A quirky but significant provision in the Code addresses the legal status of illegitimate children, reflecting revolutionary France's complex relationship with traditional family structures. While the Code maintains marriage as the preferred basis for family formation, it also provides legal protections for children born outside marriage that reflect both humanitarian concerns and practical necessities in a society disrupted by war and revolution. These provisions will prove influential in later developments of family law across Europe and the Americas. The Code's treatment of commercial relationships reveals another dimension of its systematic approach to legal organization. Unlike medieval law with its guild regulations and feudal restrictions, the Code creates a framework for modern market economy based on freedom of contract and security of property rights. You observe how legal provisions that seem purely technical actually embody a comprehensive vision of economic organization that prioritizes individual initiative and market efficiency over traditional community controls. The educational impact of systematic codification proves as significant as its practical legal effects. Law schools throughout Europe begin reorganizing their curricula around the Code's systematic structure, training lawyers to think in terms of comprehensive legal principles rather than accumulated precedents and local customs. You're witnessing the professionalization of legal education and the creation of a class of technically trained lawyers who understand law as a systematic science rather than traditional craft. As your time in Napoleonic Europe draws to a close, you find yourself in conversation with one of the Code's principal drafters, who reflects on their achievement's broader significance. "We have created not just law, but a method for creating law," he explains, gesturing towards shelves lined with legal commentaries already beginning to accumulate around the new Code. Other societies can adapt our approach to their own circumstances, creating systematic law without abandoning their particular traditions and values. His prediction proves remarkably accurate. The methodological innovations you've observed in the creation of the Code Civil will influence legal development far beyond France's borders and long after Napoleon's political empire has crumbled. The systematic organization, clear language, and comprehensive scope that characterize the Code will become the standard for modern legal systems worldwide. You've witnessed the birth of contemporary legal methodology, the transformation of law from accumulated tradition to systematic science that can be consciously designed to serve social purposes. The Code Civil's influence on constitutionalism, international law, and legal education will prove as lasting as its direct adoption in various national legal systems. You leave Napoleonic France with profound appreciation for how systematic legal thinking can serve both individual freedom and social organization, creating frameworks for human cooperation sophisticated enough to govern complex modern societies while remaining accessible to the citizens they claim to serve. You stand in the sweltering heat of Philadelphia's Independence Hall during the summer of 1787, watching as delegates from 13 former colonies wrestle with questions that will define constitutional government for centuries to come. The windows are sealed shut to prevent eavesdropping, making the air thick and oppressive as James Madison spreads his carefully prepared notes across a wooden table worn smooth by decades of use. Around you, the most brilliant political minds of their generation debate fundamental questions about power, rights, and the relationship between individual liberty and collective governance that no society has successfully resolved. The challenge facing these constitutional framers exceeds anything you've witnessed in previous legal developments. Unlike ancient lawgivers who could impose their will through royal authority or religious command, these delegates must create a government that derives its legitimacy from popular consent while remaining powerful enough to govern effectively. The Articles of Confederation, which currently bind the states together, have proven too weak to address the practical needs of an emerging nation, but no one wants to create a system so strong that it replicates the royal tyranny they recently fought a revolution to escape. Alexander Hamilton rises to address the assembly, his youthful face showing the strain of weeks spent in intense debate. "We are attempting something unprecedented in human history," he declares, his voice carrying across the hushed chamber. "A government that is simultaneously energetic enough to govern and limited enough to preserve liberty. Every previous attempt at popular government has ended either in anarchy or despotism. You're witnessing humanity's most sophisticated attempt to solve the fundamental paradox of political authority: how to create power sufficient to protect rights without creating power so great that it threatens the rights it's meant to protect. The concept of separation of powers that emerges from these debates represents a revolutionary approach to constitutional design. Rather than concentrating authority in a single institution, whether monarchical or democratic, the framers are creating a system where different governmental functions are assigned to different institutions that can check and balance each other's authority. You observe detailed discussions about how legislative, executive, and judicial powers can be structured to prevent any single branch from dominating the others, while ensuring that government remains capable of decisive action when necessary. James Madison's contributions to these constitutional discussions reveal the sophisticated political science underlying the American experiment. His careful study of historical confederations, ancient republics, and contemporary European governments has convinced him that pure democracy inevitably destroys itself through factional violence and majority tyranny. The solution he proposes involves creating a large republic where diverse interests will balance each other out, preventing any single faction from gaining permanent control over governmental power. The debate over representation exposes fundamental tensions between democratic theory and practical politics that continue to challenge constitutional governments. Small states demand equal representation to protect themselves from domination by larger neighbours, while large states argue that population-based representation better reflects democratic principles. The eventual compromise, creating a bicameral legislature with different representation formulas in each house, demonstrates how constitutional design must balance competing values rather than implementing pure theoretical principles. You observe how the question of individual rights creates unexpected complications for constitutional thinking. Many delegates assume that a government of limited, enumerated powers cannot threaten rights. It has no authority to regulate, making explicit protection unnecessary. But others argue that without specific constitutional guarantees, governmental power will inevitably expand beyond its intended boundaries. This debate over whether rights need explicit protection or exist naturally as limitations on governmental authority will influence constitutional development across the globe. The federal structure that emerges from these Philadelphia deliberations represents another innovative approach to the challenge of governing large, diverse societies. Rather than choosing between national unity and local self-government, the Constitution creates a system where both state and national authorities exercise genuine governmental power within their respective spheres. You're witnessing the creation of federalism as a constitutional principle, the idea that political authority can be divided vertically between different levels of government as well as horizontally between different branches. A particularly fascinating aspect of the constitutional debates involves the question of judicial review, though the delegates don't use that term. Several speakers suggest that courts should have authority to invalidate laws that violate constitutional provisions, but others worry that such power would make unelected judges the final arbitrators of constitutional meaning. The eventual constitution leaves this question desperately ambiguous, allowing later generations to work out the relationship between judicial interpretation and democratic governance. The ratification debates that follow the Philadelphia Convention reveal both the strengths and weaknesses of the proposed constitutional system. You travel from state to state, observing public discussions where ordinary citizens debate complex questions about governmental structure, individual rights, and federal authority. The Federalist Papers, written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay to defend the Constitution, provide sophisticated theoretical justifications for constitutional innovations that many people initially find confusing or threatening. Anti-federalist criticisms of the proposed constitution raise important questions about the relationship between constitutional theory and democratic practice. You listen as opponents argue that the new government will be too remote from popular control, too complex for ordinary citizens to understand, and too powerful for individual rights to remain secure. Their concerns about governmental complexity, elite domination, and the erosion of local self-government anticipate critiques that will challenge constitutional government throughout its subsequent development. The Bill of Rights that emerges from ratification compromises demonstrates how constitutional law must balance competing values and interests. The first 10 amendments provide explicit protections for individual liberties that many framers thought were already secured by the Constitution's structure of limited government, but the amendments also create new questions about the relationship between individual rights and majority rule that will require generations of judicial interpretation to resolve. As you observe the early implementation of the new Constitution, you witness how written constitutional text must be translated into practical governmental operations through political practice and judicial interpretation. The first Congress faces questions about executive authority, legislative procedure, and federal-state relations that the Constitution addresses only in general terms. President Washington's decisions about executive power, Chief Justice Marshall's rulings about judicial authority, and Congress's choices about legislative process all contribute to constitutional development in ways the framers couldn't fully anticipate. Historians still argue whether the American constitutional experiment represents the culmination of Enlightenment political thinking or a pragmatic response to immediate political necessities. But observing the founding process suggests both. Characterizations contain important truths. The Constitution embodies sophisticated theoretical insights about governmental structure and individual rights, but it also reflects practical compromises necessary to create a functioning government that competing interests could accept. The international influence of American constitutional innovations becomes apparent as you travel through Europe in the decades following ratification. French revolutionaries study American constitutional principles while drafting their own fundamental laws. Latin American independence movements adapt American federal structures to their particular circumstances. Even monarchical governments begin to experiment with constitutional limitations on royal authority that reflect American Innovations in Balancing Governmental Power and Individual Liberty. A quirky but revealing provision in the Constitution addresses the relationship between state and federal authority over interstate commerce. Seemingly a technical economic matter that proves crucial for constitutional development, the Commerce Clause becomes a major source of federal authority over economic and social regulation, demonstrating how constitutional provisions designed for specific 18th century problems can evolve to address unforeseen 21st century challenges. As your time with the American founders draws to a close, you find yourself in conversation with Thomas Jefferson, who has returned from France to serve as the first Secretary of State. Every generation must write its own constitution, he suggests, reflecting on the challenges of creating permanent law for changing societies. But we have provided a foundation that can grow and adapt while preserving essential principles of liberty and self-government. And his words capture both the achievement and the ongoing challenge of constitutional government, creating frameworks stable enough to provide predictable governance, yet flexible enough to serve changing social needs. The constitutional system you've observed emerging from Philadelphia will prove remarkably durable, surviving civil war, economic transformation, social revolution, and international conflict while maintaining essential continuity with its founding principles. Its innovations in federal structure, separation of powers, and constitutional rights will influence democratic development worldwide. You've witnessed humanity's most successful attempt to create governmental institutions that serve both liberty and order, individual rights and collective needs, establishing constitutional democracy as a viable alternative to both autocracy and anarchy. You find yourself standing in the smoky, coal-darkened streets of Manchester in 1842, where the Industrial Revolution has transformed not just the landscape but the very nature of human society in ways that existing legal systems struggle to comprehend. The thunderous clatter of steam-powered machinery echoes from massive brick factories that tower over rows of cramped workers' housing, while the acrid smell of coal smoke mingles with the chemical odours of new manufacturing processes. Around you, a world is being born that operates according to principles no previous civilization has encountered, creating legal challenges that will force fundamental reconsiderations of property rights, individual liberty, and governmental authority. The factory whistle's shrill blast announces the beginning of another 14-hour workday, and you watch as streams of workers, many of them children barely 10 years old, hurry toward the massive mill buildings that dominate the industrial landscape. The sight of 8-year-old children operating dangerous machinery for wages that barely provide subsistence raises questions about individual freedom and social responsibility that existing legal frameworks cannot adequately address. If parents voluntarily agree to send their children to work, and factory owners offer employment on mutually acceptable terms, what authority does law possess to interfere with these apparently consensual arrangements? A parliamentary committee investigating working conditions in textile mills provides your first glimpse of how legal thinking begins to adapt to industrial realities. You observe committee members questioning factory owners, workers, and medical experts about the health effects of long hours, dangerous machinery, and polluted air. The testimony reveals a world where traditional legal concepts like voluntary contract and property rights produce outcomes that violate emerging social understandings of human dignity and community welfare. The testimony of a mill worker named Sarah Carpenter particularly strikes you with its implications for legal theory. She describes working conditions that would have been unimaginable in pre-industrial society: machinery that never stops, supervisors who forbid conversation, air so thick with cotton dust that breathing becomes difficult. When asked why she doesn't seek employment elsewhere, she explains that all factories impose similar conditions and her family needs her wages to survive. You're witnessing the emergence of economic relationships where formal freedom coexists with practical coercion in ways that challenge traditional legal assumptions about voluntary agreement. Lord Ashley, later the Earl of Shaftesbury, emerges as a leading advocate for factory reform legislation that represents a fundamental shift in legal philosophy. His arguments before Parliament go beyond specific humanitarian concerns to address broader questions about the proper relationship between individual liberty and social welfare. The freedom to starve is no freedom at all, he declares, advocating for legal limitations on working hours and conditions that prioritize human welfare over contractual liberty and property rights. You observe heated parliamentary debates over the 10 hours bill, which would limit the working day for women and children in textile factories. Opponents argue that such legislation violates fundamental principles of economic freedom and property rights that form the foundation of liberal society. If individuals can voluntarily agree to work long hours for low wages, they contend, governmental interference represents tyrannical paternalism that undermines both personal responsibility and economic efficiency. But supporters of factory legislation develop new theoretical justifications for legal intervention that expand traditional understandings of governmental authority. They argue that true individual liberty requires not just formal freedom from legal restraint, but substantive capacity to make meaningful choices about life circumstances. When economic necessity forces people into arrangements that damage their health, education, or family relationship, law has both authority and obligation to protect human welfare, even at the cost of limiting contractual freedom. The development of corporate law during this period reveals another dimension of industrialization's legal challenges. You observe the formation of joint stock companies with limited liability that allow investors to pool capital for large-scale industrial enterprises while limiting their personal financial risk. These legal innovations make possible the massive capital investments that industrial development requires, but they also create new forms of economic power that traditional legal categories struggle to regulate effectively. A particularly revealing case involves a railway company whose negligent maintenance causes a catastrophic accident that kills dozens of passengers. Under traditional tort law, the company's individual shareholders might bear personal responsibility for the damages their enterprise caused, but the doctrine of corporate limited liability protects individual investors from claims beyond their initial investment, raising fundamental questions about accountability in an era of industrial-scale economic activity. The pollution produced by the industrial processes creates entirely new categories of legal problems that existing property law cannot adequately address. You witness disputes between factory owners and neighbouring landowners over air and water pollution that affects agricultural productivity and human health. Traditional property law protects owners' right to use their land as they choose, but industrial activities can damage neighbouring properties in ways that make strict property boundaries meaningless. How can law balance industrial development against environmental protection when both serve important social purposes? Railroad development illustrates particularly clearly how industrial technology challenges existing legal frameworks. The power of eminent domain, previously used primarily for military necessities, becomes a routine tool for acquiring private property for commercial railroad construction. You observe legal proceedings where landowners who refuse to sell their property to railroad companies find themselves forced to accept compensation determined by government officials rather than market negotiation. The transformation of eminent domain from emergency governmental power to standard economic development tool reflects broader changes in the relationship between private property and public purpose. labour organisation presents another set of legal challenges as workers begin forming unions to bargain collectively with industrial employers. Under traditional legal doctrine, agreements among workers to demand higher wages or better conditions constitute criminal conspiracy and restraint of trade. But industrial employment relationships differ fundamentally from traditional craftwork or agricultural labour in ways that make individual bargaining ineffective. You watch as courts struggle to apply conspiracy law to collective action that seems necessary for workers to achieve anything approaching equal bargaining power with their industrial employers. Historians still argue whether industrial development required fundamental changes in legal philosophy or simply new applications of existing principles. But observing the transformation firsthand suggests the changes go deeper than technical legal adjustments. Industrialization creates social relationships characterized by unprecedented concentrations of economic power, complex interdependence between strangers, and environmental effects that transcend traditional property boundaries. These new social realities require legal innovations that expand governmental regulatory authority while developing new understandings of individual rights and social responsibility. A quirky but significant case emerges when a factory owner in Birmingham attempts to patent a new manufacturing process that depends on child labour organised according to precisely timed procedures. The patent application raises fascinating questions about the relationship between technological innovation and social values. Can legal systems grant exclusive rights to processes that depend on exploiting children, even if those processes increase economic efficiency? The eventual denial of the patent reflects emerging legal recognition that technological progress cannot be completely separated from moral considerations. The development of administrative law during this period demonstrates how legal systems adapt to govern complex industrial societies. Traditional legal institutions designed for simpler agricultural communities cannot effectively regulate railroads, factories, and mining companies that operate across multiple jurisdictions and affect thousands of people. You observe the creation of specialized regulatory agencies with technical expertise and administrative authority that supplement traditional judicial and legislative institutions. As your time in industrial Britain draws to a close, you find yourself in conversation with John Stuart Mill, whose political philosophy attempts to reconcile individual liberty with social welfare in ways that address industrial society's new realities. The principle of individual freedom must be preserved, he argues, but we must recognize that true freedom requires social conditions that make meaningful choice possible. Sometimes governmental intervention serves liberty by creating the conditions where individual choice can be genuinely free. His words capture the fundamental challenge that industrialization poses for legal thinking: how to maintain commitments to individual liberty and limited government while addressing social problems that individual action alone cannot resolve. The legal innovations you've observed in industrial Britain represent humanity's first systematic attempt to govern technological societies that operate according to principles unknown to previous civilizations. The solutions developed here will influence legal systems worldwide as other societies confront similar challenges of balancing technological progress with human welfare, individual freedom with social responsibility, and economic efficiency with environmental sustainability. You leave industrial Britain with profound appreciation for law's capacity to evolve and adapt, while maintaining essential continuity with fundamental principles of justice and human dignity. The transformation you've witnessed demonstrates that legal systems can respond creatively to unprecedented social challenges without abandoning their core commitments to individual rights and democratic governance. You find yourself in the gleaming towers of a modern law firm in downtown Manhattan, where floor-to-ceiling windows offer a panoramic view of a city that pulses with the energy of global commerce and digital communication. The year is 234, and around you, lawyers are navigating legal challenges that would have been incomprehensible to every previous generation of jurists you've encountered on this long journey through legal history. Artificial intelligence systems draft contracts. Cryptocurrency transactions cross international boundaries in milliseconds. And social media platforms moderate speech for billions of users according to policies that carry more practical authority than many national constitutions. The senior partner, her tablet displaying real-time updates from legal databases around the world, explains how modern legal practice has been transformed by the same technological forces that are reshaping every aspect of human society. We're still applying principles that trace back to ancient Rome and medieval England, she notes, gesturing toward digital law libraries that contain centuries of accumulated legal wisdom. But we're applying them to situations that no previous generation could have imagined. How do you apply contract law to smart contracts that execute themselves? How do you determine jurisdiction when a crime occurs in virtual reality? A case conference reveals the complexity of contemporary legal challenges as the firm's attorneys debate a dispute involving data privacy, international commerce, and artificial intelligence. A European company has used AI to analyze personal data collected from American consumers, creating products sold globally through digital platforms based in Asia. Which nation's laws apply? How do you serve legal papers on an AI system? What happens when the relevant evidence exists as algorithms that even their creators don't fully understand? You're witnessing how ancient principles of jurisdiction, evidence, and liability must evolve to address technological realities that challenge every traditional legal category. The constitutional law section buzzes with discussions about how fundamental rights apply to digital environments where most human communication and commerce now occurs. The First Amendment protects freedom of speech. But what does that mean when private social media companies control the forums where most public debate happens? The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches. But how does that apply to data collection systems that know more about individuals than they know about themselves? You're observing how constitutional principles developed for agricultural societies must adapt to govern digital civilizations. A fascinating case study emerges from the firm's environmental law practice, where attorneys are developing legal frameworks for climate change litigation that attempts to hold corporations and governments accountable for environmental damage that spans generations and continents. The challenge exceeds even the industrial pollution problems you witnessed in 19th century Britain. How do you establish legal causation when thousands of actors contribute to environmental changes that affect billions of people across decades? How do you balance present economic needs against future environmental risks when the costs and benefits fall on different generations? The International Law Department illustrates how globalization has created legal challenges that transcend traditional notions of national sovereignty. You observe negotiations over trade disputes, where multinational corporations possess economic resources that exceed those of many national governments. International arbitration panels resolve commercial disputes according to legal principles that exist independently of any particular nation's laws. The ancient dream of universal law is being realized through economic necessity rather than political agreement, creating legal systems that operate across cultural and political boundaries. Artificial intelligence presents perhaps the most fundamental challenge to traditional legal thinking since the Industrial Revolution. You watch as lawyers debate whether AI systems can be held legally responsible for their decisions, how to ensure algorithmic fairness in criminal sentencing, and what rights humans possess when their fate is determined by the machine learning systems they cannot understand or control. The questions go beyond technical legal adjustments to challenge basic assumptions about agency, responsibility, and human dignity that have anchored legal thinking for millennia. A particularly intriguing discussion involves the legal status of virtual worlds, where people spend increasing amounts of their time in economic activity. If someone commits virtual assault in an online game, has a real crime occurred? If virtual property has a real economic value, should it receive the same legal protections as physical property? How do you apply tort law to avatars, contract law to digital goods, and family law to relationships that exist primarily in virtual spaces? You're seeing how technology creates new categories of human experience that require entirely new approaches to legal classification and regulation. The firm's privacy law specialists work on cases that involve the most intimate details of human life being collected, analysed, and commercialised by data systems that operate largely beyond traditional legal oversight. Location data reveals where people go and whom they meet. Search histories expose their thoughts and interests. Purchase records indicate their values and relationships. Financial transactions map their social networks and personal priorities. This comprehensive surveillance of daily life creates power relationships that dwarf anything previous societies experienced, requiring legal innovations that can protect human autonomy in environments where privacy seems almost impossible to maintain. Biotechnology law presents another frontier where ancient principles must address unprecedented realities. You observe debates about the legal status of genetically modified organisms, the ownership of genetic information, and the rights of artificially created biological entities. When scientists can edit human genes, create artificial life forms, and extend human lifespan indefinitely, what happens to legal concepts based on assumptions about natural biological limits? How do you regulate technologies that can fundamentally alter the human condition itself? The challenge of governing global digital platforms reveals how private corporations have acquired quasi-governmental authority that operates largely outside traditional constitutional frameworks. Social media companies make content moderation decisions that affect billions of people's access to information and ability to communicate. Search engines determine what information people can find about almost any topic. Online marketplaces control commercial relationships that span the globe. These private governance systems often possess more practical authority over daily life than democratically elected governments, but they operate according to corporate policies rather than constitutional principles. Historians still argue whether we're witnessing the evolution of existing legal principles or the emergence of entirely new forms of law. But your journey through legal tapestry suggests both processes occur simultaneously. The fundamental human needs for predictable rules, fair procedures, and accountable authority remain constant. But the technological and social contexts where these needs arise continue to evolve in ways that require constant legal adaptation and innovation. As you reflect on everything you've witnessed from those first firelit councils in prehistoric settlements to these gleaming towers of contemporary legal practice, you recognize both remarkable continuity and dramatic transformation. The desire for justice that motivated ancient lawmakers still drives contemporary legal innovation. The tension between individual freedom and collective welfare that challenged Greek democrats continues to shape constitutional debates. The need to balance stability with adaptability that concerned Roman jurists remains central to modern legal thinking. But you also recognize how each era's technological and social circumstances create unique legal challenges that require creative responses while building on accumulated wisdom from previous generations. The clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia evolved into the printed codes of early modern Europe, and now into the digital databases of contemporary legal practice. The town assemblies of medieval Europe have become the global networks of international law. The constitutional conventions of 18th century America have inspired the international human rights frameworks of the 21st century. The lawyer you've been observing closes her laptop and looks out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Every generation thinks their legal challenges are unprecedented, she muses, and in some ways they're right. But we're all part of the same ancient human project of trying to create societies where people can live together peacefully and fairly. The tools change, but the goal remains the same. Her words capture something essential about the legal journey you've witnessed. Law is humanity's ongoing attempt to translate ideals of justice into practical institutions that can govern real societies facing concrete challenges. As your long journey through legal history draws to a close, you carry with you profound appreciation for the creative intelligence that humans have brought to the challenge of governing themselves. From customs remembered around prehistoric fires to constitutional principles that span continents, from ancient codes carved in stone to digital algorithms that process millions of legal documents, the human commitment to law represents one of our species' greatest achievements. The story continues as each generation inherits accumulated legal wisdom while facing new challenges that require innovative responses to timeless questions about justice, freedom, and the proper ordering of human society. The lights of the modern city spread out below you like a vast constellation, each point of light representing human lives that depend on legal systems to protect their rights, resolve their disputes, and coordinate their collective endeavours. You've witnessed how law grows from humanity's deepest needs and highest aspirations, serving both practical necessity and moral imagination in the ongoing project of creating societies worthy of human dignity. And now, as our journey through the vast landscape of legal history comes to its gentle conclusion, you find yourself settling back into the present moment, carrying with you the wisdom of millennia. The ancient voices that called for justice around prehistoric fires have grown quiet, but their echo continues in every courthouse, every constitution, every moment when people choose law over violence to resolve their differences. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia have crumbled to dust, but the principle they established, that law should be written and knowable, lives on in every legal document you encounter today. Hammurabi's stern justice has softened into more nuanced understandings of fairness. Yet his recognition that law must be publicly proclaimed and equally applied remains foundational to every legitimate legal system. Let your mind drift peacefully across the centuries you've witnessed, feeling the gentle continuity that connects the earliest human attempts at justice to the complex legal frameworks that govern our interconnected world today. Egyptian Ma'at's feather of truth still weighs in every honest judge's conscience. Hebrew commandments still echo in every recognition that law must serve moral principles higher than human convenience. Greek democracy's bold experiment in self-governance continues wherever people participate in making the laws they live under. Roman precision and Germanic community wisdom, Islamic scholarship and medieval synthesis, English innovation and continental systematization, all these traditions flow together like streams joining a great river that continues to carve new channels while honouring its ancient sources. The constitutional experiments of revolutionary America and the systematic codes of Napoleonic Europe, the industrial adaptations of Victorian Britain and the global challenges of our digital age, Each represents humanity's ongoing attempt to create societies where justice and freedom can flourish together. As sleep begins to claim you, let these stories of human legal achievement wrap around you like a warm blanket woven from the patient efforts of countless generations who refused to accept that might makes right, who insisted that law could serve something higher than mere power, who believed that human beings deserve to live under systems of governance that respect their dignity and serve their deepest needs for order, fairness, and community. Rest peacefully in the knowledge that you are part of this great human story, heir to legal traditions that stretch back to humanity's earliest attempts to create justice and forward to possibilities we can barely imagine. The law's ancient promise that human societies can govern themselves through reason rather than force, through justice rather than arbitrary power, continues to unfold in our time as it has throughout history. Imperfect but persistent, always growing, always reaching toward a more perfect justice. Sweet dreams, knowing that tomorrow you wake as a citizen of legal traditions that represent humanity at its most hopeful and most practical, most visionary and most grounded in the simple recognition that we must find ways to live together peacefully, fairly, and with respect for the dignity that belongs to every human being by virtue of our shared humanity.